There is a town in Appalachia that does not appear on most maps. Not because no one has tried to map it, not because the roads are unmarked or the terrain is impossible, but because the town itself seems to resist documentation, as though something in the land quietly rejects the idea of being pinned down, labelled and filed away in someone else's record books. The town is called Black Hollow. It sits between two ridgelines so steep that the valley floor sees only 4 or 5 hours of direct sunlight even in midsummer. The rest of the day it lives in the kind of shade that feels like something other than shade, something heavier, something older. The trees here are not small. They are the kind of trees that make you feel like a guest. Their roots are older than the town, older than the roads, older than the first European boots that ever pressed into the mud of these mountains. And the forest itself, if you stand at its edge long enough, has a quality that is difficult to name. It does not feel hostile. It does not feel welcoming. It feels aware. Black Hollow has a population of somewhere between 300 and 400 people, depending on who you ask and when you ask them. The census has never quite agreed with itself on the number. Old-timers say this is because people come and go. Newcomers say it's because the post office loses mail. Children say it's because sometimes people simply aren't there one day, and then one day they are again, and no one talks about where they went in between. The houses are old. Not charming old. Not quaint old. Old in the way that makes you aware of everything that happened inside them before you arrived. The wood is dark from decades of mountain weather. The porches sag slightly in the middle. The windows, especially the upstairs ones, have a quality to their glass that makes the light coming through them look like it belongs to a different time of day than the light outside. The town has one gas station, one diner, one hardware store, and one church. The church is Methodist. It is not the church that concerns us tonight. The one that concerns us never had a congregation, never had a pastor. In fact, the church that matters most in this story never had a building at all. Just a bell, ringing from somewhere inside the forest, in a place where no structure has ever stood. Locals call the area Dead Bell Ridge. They have called it that for as long as anyone can remember, which in Black Hollow means for as long as anyone is willing to admit. The rule in Black Hollow is not written anywhere. There is no sign at the trailhead, no warning posted at the ranger station, no local ordinance, no formal community policy, no pamphlet handed to newcomers. But the rule exists, and everyone knows it, and everyone follows it, and the way they follow it, casually without drawing attention to it, as though it requires no explanation, is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Do not go past the old fire tower after dark. People who ask why receive answers that are reasonable and slightly too quick. The terrain is dangerous up there. There are old mine shafts hidden under leaves and deadfall, openings wide enough to swallow a person before they realise they're falling. The fog comes in fast at elevation, the kind of thick directional fog that destroys your sense of up and down. The creeks run cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. The trails double back on themselves in ways that don't make cartographic sense. All of this is true, none of it is the reason. The reason is simpler and far worse. People who go past the fire tower after dark sometimes come back wrong, and sometimes don't come back at all. The ones who come back wrong are not violent. They are not delusional in the clinical sense. They are not suffering from exposure or head trauma, though doctors who examine them always look hard for both. They come back disoriented in a very specific way. Their phones are dead. Their watches have stopped. Their memories contain gaps. Not fuzzy, dreamlike gaps, but hard, clean gaps, as though someone removed a section of time with a scalpel and sealed the wound neatly shut. They insist they were only gone for minutes. They return wearing the same clothes, carrying the same things they left with, sometimes still warm from body heat. But hours have passed, sometimes days. The ones who don't come back at all are a different kind of story. They leave no trail, no blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of direction. Search teams, and there have been search teams, quiet ones organised by county sheriffs who do not particularly want the details in any public report, find nothing useful. No evidence of animal attack, no evidence of falling, no evidence of entering water, No evidence of leaving the mountain by any route that anyone can identify. Just absence. Clean, complete, total absence. As though the forest simply inhaled and did not exhale. The first documented case is October of 1954. A surveyor named Walter Keane arrives in Black Hollow with a canvas bag full of measuring equipment, a set of old mineral rights maps, and a contract from a regional land office to update boundary records in advance of coal company purchases. He is 29 years old. He is methodical. He is experienced. He has spent the better part of 6 years walking difficult mountain terrain in this region and has never had a serious accident. He knows how to read weather. He knows how to read topography. He is exactly the kind of person who does not get lost. He disappears on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. The leaves are at peak colour. The sky is clear. There is no fog, no rain, no unusual weather of any kind. He tells the man at the diner where he's headed, a ridge north of town that the land office maps label as Sector 12, but which locals have called Dead Bell Ridge for generations, and he walks out the door with his bag over his shoulder and a thermos of coffee and is not seen again for 3 days. When he returns, he is standing in the centre of the road at dawn, not walking, standing, still. His boots are muddy but not torn. His clothes are unchanged. His survey bag is over his shoulder. He is holding his thermos, which still has coffee in it. The sheriff who finds him says later, in a private conversation, never formally recorded, that Walter Keane had the look of a man who had just stepped through a door and found the room on the other side to be different than expected. Not frightened, not traumatized, confused in a specific, concentrated way, like a man doing very careful arithmetic in his head. When asked where he has been for 3 days, Keane says with complete sincerity that he has been gone for about 20 minutes. He describes what happened in careful, measured language. He was walking the ridge. He heard birds go quiet. He heard a sound from below ground, not a rumble, not a crack, but a sustained electrical hum, low and continuous like a transformer behind a fence. And then the sun moved, not slowly, not by degrees. It lurched, sideways, he says, not up or down, but sideways, as though something briefly interrupted the relationship between him and the sky. And then it was quiet again, and he walked back down the mountain. In his survey book, investigators find a map he drew of the ridge. The map is detailed, accurate, and wrong in a very precise way. It shows roads that do not exist, a junction where there is currently only forest, a water tower that has not been built, a paved parking area, fencing, what appears to be an antenna array. None of these things exist in 1954. All of them will exist by the early 1970s. The case of Walter Keane does not make the newspapers. The land office lists him as recovered and reassigned. The sheriff's report notes disorientation incident and files it under weather-related emergencies. Life in Black Hollow continues. But somewhere, someone reads the sheriff's report. Someone reads it very carefully. And in the spring of 1955, a small team arrives in Black Hollow under the cover of geological assessment. They carry federal identification. They say they are studying seismic activity and old mine stability. They are polite, professional, and careful never to say anything definitive about anything. They set up equipment in the woods north of town. They bury cables. They place sensor arrays. They walk the ridgelines with instruments that locals, peering through binoculars from a distance, cannot identify. The team is led by a government geophysicist named Dr. Harold Niven, a lean, quiet man in his mid-40s who speaks in complete sentences and never volunteers information. He's accompanied by a civilian radio engineer named Martha Ellison, who's the only one of the group who ever smiles, and an army liaison named Colonel James Rourke, who does not smile, does not explain himself, and does not stay in the local motel like the others, but instead sleeps in one of the unmarked vehicles parked on the logging road above town. Officially, the project lasts 6 months. Publicly, the team packs up and leaves. Privately, beneath the floor of an abandoned mining office on the north edge of town, they build something. They call it Station 9. It is not large. Perhaps the footprint of a modest house, all underground. accessed through a hatch concealed beneath a false shelf in the mining office's back room. But it is sophisticated, lined with electromagnetic shielding, equipped with recording equipment years ahead of what is commercially available, powered by a buried generator line connected to the county grid under a billing alias that reads as agricultural maintenance. The purpose of Station 9, as written in its founding document, a 3-page memo that will not surface for decades, is to observe, record, and attempt to characterize what it calls localized temporal displacement events occurring in the vicinity of Dead Bell Ridge. Temporal displacement events, not geological anomalies, not electromagnetic interference, not atmospheric distortion, temporal displacement, time. Dr. Niven's early theory is methodical and grounded, the product of a man who has spent his entire career looking for physical explanations for unusual physical phenomena. He maps the geology beneath the ridge with care. What he finds is unusual, though not immediately alarming. A deep fold of quartz-rich sedimentary rock interlaced with iron deposits, threaded through by the hollow spaces of old mine tunnels that run in directions the coal company records do not fully explain. The combination of these elements, the quartz acting as a piezoelectric material under pressure, the iron distorting local magnetic fields, the tunnels creating resonance chambers of unusual acoustic and electromagnetic character, produces effects that are measurable and strange. Compasses do not behave near the ridge. They spin slowly, then freeze, then spin again. Radio signals distort in patterns that suggest interference from a local source that cannot be found. Clocks, mechanical ones, battery-powered ones, all of them, lose time at rates that correlate with seismic microactivity and atmospheric pressure changes. All of this is strange. None of it alone is impossible. Then, on March 11th, 1957, everything changes. At 2:16 in the morning, Station 9's radio receiver, a custom-built unit designed to capture signals across an unusually wide frequency range, picks up a local broadcast, a weather forecast, a station identification, a date. The date is in 1972, 15 years in the future. The broadcast is 8 seconds long. It is faint. It is partially buried under noise, but it is identifiable. The station call sign matches a regional radio station that does not yet exist in 1957. The forecast language, the terminology, the broadcast conventions, all consistent with what radio production will look like a decade and a half from now. The recording is run through every available filter. Every possible mundane explanation is tested and discarded. The audio is real. Dr. Niven writes his conclusion in a memo that is immediately classified and sealed. The anomaly at Dead Bell Ridge does not affect the perception of time. It affects access to time. The ridge does not create the subjective experience of temporal distortion in observers. It creates actual contact between distinct temporal positions. We are not studying how people experience time differently near this location. We are studying a location where different moments in time share physical proximity. In plainer language, Black Hollow does not distort time. It opens into it. Now we move forward, not 15 years, not 50. We come to the present, or something close enough to it that the details feel recognisable. A man named Dr. Caleb Rourke drives into Black Hollow on a grey November morning with a box of old papers on the passenger seat, and no particular plan. He is in his mid-30s. He is a geophysicist, not a dramatic one, not a television scientist with windswept hair and a theory about everything. He teaches earth sciences at a university, writes papers that are read by the people who need to read them and no one else, and has spent the better part of a decade building a reputation as one of the more reliable skeptics in his field. When something unusual happens, a strange tremor pattern, a magnetic field anomaly, a cluster of unexplained events in a geological context, Caleb Rourke is the person other scientists call when they want someone to explain why it is not as unusual as it seems. He's been very good at this. He has never been wrong enough to matter. The box on his passenger seat belonged to his grandfather, Colonel James Rourke, who died 3 months ago at the age of 91 and left behind very little in the way of explanation. Inside the box, a hand-drawn map of a ridge in the mountains of Appalachia, labelled in handwriting Caleb recognises as his grandfather's, with the words Dead Bell Ridge written in the top margin. A set of radio logs from something called Station 9, spanning from 1955 to what appears to be the late 1980s. A stack of photographs, black and white, showing government equipment in the woods, antennas, cable conduits, sensor housings, a hatch in the floor of what looks like an old building, and a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges, the flap secured with a strip of medical tape on which his grandfather has written in blue ink, "Do not return after the clocks stop." Caleb tells himself as he drives that there is a reasonable explanation for all of this. His grandfather was an army liaison. He worked on Cold War surveillance and reconnaissance projects. Strange documents in old boxes are exactly what you would expect from a man who spent decades in that world. The sealed envelope is dramatic, but probably contains something bureaucratic. A standing order, a security reminder, a protocol. He tells himself this. And then he opens the box again at a rest stop outside town and finds something he missed the first time. A folded sheet of paper tucked flat against the bottom of the box, with no label, no header, no date. It is a list of names, 23 names. Beside each name, 2 pieces of information, a date and a location, all variations of the same area near the ridge. And in the right margin beside each name, a single word in different handwriting from his grandfather's. A word that has been added later, in darker ink, updated over time. The word is either returned or unresolved. 17 names say returned. 5 say unresolved. The 23rd name, at the bottom of the list, has no date beside it, no location, no annotation in the right margin. But the name is there. It is Caleb's name, his full name, his middle name included, spelled correctly, in his grandfather's handwriting. He does not leave. Of course he does not leave. You already know he does not leave, because the kind of person who leaves when they find their name on a list like that is not the kind of person this story is about. The kind of person this story is about is the kind who puts the paper back in the box, stares at the road for a long moment, and then drives the rest of the way into town. Caleb checks into the motel on the main street, the same motel, though he doesn't know it yet, where Dr. Harold Niven stayed in the spring of 1955. He sets up a workspace on the room's small table and begins going through the box with professional care. He's not allowing himself to feel the things the box is trying to make him feel. He is categorizing, cross-referencing, building a picture from verifiable pieces. The radio logs from Station 9 are the most detailed documents in the box. They cover decades of monitoring, with entries that become progressively more cryptic and sparse as the years advance, as though whoever was recording them had stopped expecting anyone to read them and was instead writing for themselves. The early entries are bureaucratic. Frequencies observed, signal characteristics noted, compass deviation measurements taken, clock synchronization errors logged. Then the entries change. Around 1957 the language becomes urgent. The entries from March of that year are almost breathless, precise and careful in the way of someone who understands that what they are writing is either the most important thing ever documented or the ravings of a mind that has broken under isolation. Dr. Niven's handwriting appears in the logs here, identified by the signature at the bottom of the longer entries. He writes about the radio signal from the future. He writes about the team's response. He writes about what they decide not to put in the official report. He writes, "We have agreed not to characterize the anomaly as temporal in origin in any document that will leave this station. The practical reason is obvious. The less obvious reason is that any document acknowledging this phenomenon will be used to justify experiments that will make the situation worse. We know this. We have no evidence for it, but we know it." Caleb reads this several times. The sentence that keeps stopping him is the last one. They had no evidence, but they knew it. As a scientist, he has spent his entire career treating that kind of certainty as the enemy of knowledge. Right now, sitting at a small table in a mountain motel with his name at the bottom of a list he's never seen before, he's beginning to understand how a man could know something without evidence and be right. He spends his first week in Black Hollow doing what he knows how to do, talking to people, looking at documents, overlaying data on maps. The locals are the way mountain town locals often are with outsiders. Not unfriendly, but measured. They answer what is asked. They volunteer nothing. The older ones, the ones who have lived here long enough to have grandparents buried in the churchyard, are harder to read. They don't become more closed as the questions get closer to the ridge. They become more careful, more precise in their language, as though they have thought a great deal about exactly which words to use when this conversation eventually happens. A woman named Grace Hollis, who's in her late 70s and runs the hardware store and has been running it since before Caleb was born, is the most direct. She listens to his questions without interrupting, which is unusual. Then she says, "The people who go up and don't come back aren't dead. That's the thing. You feel it. A person who's dead, they're just gone. These ones, you can feel them somewhere, like they're on the other side of a window you can't quite reach." She pauses. The ones who come back are the ones who figured out where the window was. Caleb doesn't know what to do with this, so he writes it down and moves on. What he can do with data is different. He overlays 60 years of missing person records, pulled from county archives, sheriff's reports, old newspapers, and his grandfather's list, onto a topographic map of the area. The result is immediate and clear. Every disappearance occurs within a crescent-shaped zone, roughly 2 kilometres long and perhaps 300 metres wide, arcing around the western face of Dead Bell Ridge. The pattern is not random. It is not spread across the terrain in the way that accidents spread. It has a shape, a boundary. It is as though something in that specific area has a quality the surrounding land does not have, a quality that intersects with people in a specific and recurring way. He cross-references the disappearance dates with atmospheric and geological data, solar storm activity, seismic microactivity, barometric pressure shifts. What he finds makes the hair on his arms stand up in a way that he will later admit is the first genuinely involuntary physical response the data has ever provoked in him in his professional life. The correlations are almost perfect. Every disappearance is preceded within 48 hours by one or more of the following: a significant solar storm, a cluster of seismic microtremors in the 1 to 3 Hz range, or a rapid barometric drop of more than 15 millibars. Often all three together. It is as though the rift, if that is what it is, breathes, opens during certain conditions, closes when the conditions pass, and people who are in the wrong place during the wrong conditions pass through without choosing to. Then Evan Mallory disappears. Evan is 17. He's local, born and raised in Black Hollow, which means he knows the rule, and has decided it doesn't apply to him in the way it applies to everyone else, which is exactly the kind of decision that 17-year-olds make when they are more interested in content views than in their own continued existence on this particular timeline. He goes up the mountain with his phone to film the inside of an old mine entrance that he has been planning to live stream for weeks. He does this at night because the darkness is, in his own words in a text message to a friend, more cinematic. He tells no one adult where he is going. He sets up his stream at 11:40 p.m. on a Thursday and begins walking. The stream runs for 11 minutes. The first 8 are mundane. Trees, the beam of his phone flashlight, his own breathing, the crunch of dry leaves. He talks to his viewers in the easy, slightly performative way of someone who's been doing this long enough to narrate their own life without thinking about it. Then the phone swings toward the trees to his left, and the narration stops. For 23 seconds, Evan says nothing. The camera shows the edge of the forest, very dark, very still. There is no visible fog, there is no obvious source of light. But in the upper right corner of the frame, past the tree line, the darkness is slightly different from what it should be. Not lighter, not glowing, just different. The way a room is different when something in it has changed position while you were sleeping. Then Evan's voice, quiet now, stripped of performance. Why is it daylight over there? The stream ends. Search teams find his backpack the following morning, sitting upright on the trail about 400 metres below the old fire tower. His phone is inside it. The battery is at 92%. The footage is corrupted. Not the live stream, which exists on the server, but a second video file on the device itself, which appears to have been recorded after the stream ended and contains no recoverable visual data. The file's metadata, when Caleb manages to recover it, shows something that stops him cold in the middle of the motel room at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in November. The video file was created on a date that has not happened yet, a date 14 months in the future. He sets up instruments near the ridge. He does this quietly at night on foot, carrying equipment in a pack that he has told the university he is using for a solo field study in the region. He is not sure what he is looking for. He is sure he cannot ask anyone else to look with him. He places atomic clock synchronization devices at 6 points around the crescent zone. He sets up electromagnetic field meters on stakes. He runs thermal camera cables up through the undergrowth to a monitor set back from the ridge. He buries seismic sensors at 2 depths. He places a low-frequency audio recorder, the kind used for infrasound monitoring near volcanoes, in a hollow at the base of an old beech tree. Then he waits. The first 2 nights are nothing. The instruments record. The data is normal, within expected parameters for the terrain and geology. The clocks are synchronized. The EMF readings are low. The thermal cameras show the ordinary temperature signature of a forest at night. Cooler air pooling in low spots. Warmer patches where decomposing leaves generate heat. Occasional small animal movement. On the 3rd night, everything changes at exactly 2:16 a.m. All 6 atomic clocks lose 9 minutes simultaneously. Not gradually. Not in a pattern that suggests mechanical failure or battery drain. Simultaneously. 9 minutes. Gone. As though the clock stepped sideways from one moment to a moment that came later, without passing through the time in between. The thermal camera shows something in the forest that has no physical explanation. A vertical line of elevated temperature. Not a line of fire. Not an animal. Not a heat vent. A vertical seam, roughly 2 meters tall and perhaps 30 centimeters wide, in which the air temperature is dramatically higher than the surrounding forest. The image on the monitor shows it clearly. A doorway-shaped heat signature in the middle of the trees, as precise and deliberate as if someone has drawn a line in the air with a very hot marker. Beyond the line, the thermal signature is different from the rest of the forest. The trees on the other side read as warmer. The ground reads as warmer. The air reads as warmer. Not hotter. Just warmer than the night should allow, as though on the other side of that line it is a different time of year, or a different time of day. Caleb picks up the audio monitor and begins walking toward the seam. He hears voices before he reaches it. Not one voice, not 2. A layered, overlapping collection of sounds that resolves, as he gets closer, into discrete audio fragments from what seem to be entirely different moments in time. A police dispatch crackling and formal, using radio codes he doesn't recognise. A weather report, calm and professional, calling for temperatures in a month that has not yet arrived. Children's voices, distant and indistinct. A car horn. A woman crying. A man's voice, very close, speaking his name. He stops walking. His name. Spoken clearly, from the other side of a vertical seam of heat, in the middle of a November forest, in a voice that sounds like no one he knows, and somehow like everyone he has ever known. He walks the last few meters to the edge of the seam and looks through. Black Hollow is on the other side, the same valley, the same ridge lines, the same church steeple visible in the distance over the tree line, but not the same town. The houses he can see through the seam are collapsed, not burned, collapsed. The way old structures collapse when no one has maintained them for decades and the snow and rain have had their way with them over a long quiet time. The roads are cracked and lifted by tree roots. The trees are growing through rooftops. The gas station is a shell. The diner is a wall. The town has been abandoned for a very long time, but in the distance, on the north edge of what used to be town, a single light is on. It is coming from the direction of the old mining office. Station 9 is still active. He pulls back from the seam. He documents what he has seen. He drives back to the motel at 4 a.m. with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind doing something between reasoning and refusing to reason. He uploads his data to a secure drive. He writes up his field notes. He sends a careful, measured email to a former colleague at a federal geological research agency, someone he trusts, someone he has worked with for years, asking for help analysing some unusual anomaly data he's collected. Within 48 hours, his university email is inaccessible. His research account flags and locks. His remote data access is suspended under what the IT department's automated notice calls a security review. The secure drive he uploaded his data to returns an error when he tries to access it. The equipment he left on the ridge is gone when he goes back to retrieve it. Not scattered, not knocked over, but cleanly removed, as though by people who knew exactly where it was and what it was for. An official notice arrives at the motel under a county environmental authority letterhead, citing the removal of monitoring equipment as a precautionary measure related to mineshaft hazard assessment in the area. The notice is signed by someone with a title that does not correspond to any county department Caleb can verify. 2 men come to the motel the following evening. They knock. They wait. They do not present identification. They are calm, professional, and utterly unsurprised by everything. One of them does most of the talking. The other stands slightly to the side and looks at Caleb the way a person looks at something they have been briefed about in advance. The one who talks says, "Your grandfather understood the boundary. He respected it his entire life. We'd hoped the same applied to his family." Caleb says, "What is it?" The man says, "It's a line, and what matters isn't what's on the other side. What matters is that crossing it, studying it, and especially publicising it makes it wider. Your grandfather knew that. It took him a long time to know it, but he knew it." Then they leave. And Caleb understands that the government has not simply known about the rift at Black Hollow. They have been tending it. He goes to the mining office on a night when the cloud cover is complete and the town is asleep. The door is padlocked, but old padlocks on old buildings in old mountain towns are not significant obstacles if you have time and the right tool. He finds the back room. He finds the shelf. He finds the hatch beneath it. Station 9 is mostly empty. The equipment has been removed over decades, systematically and without waste. The shielded walls remain. The cable conduits remain. The buried power connection, he discovers when he finds the junction box, is still live, still drawing power, still routed under an alias on the county grid. Behind the second interior door, a heavy one, steel, locked with a combination he finds written in his grandfather's handwriting on the inside of the sealed envelope, he finds file cabinets. 4 of them, tall, sealed in plastic sheeting and secured with wire ties. He cuts the wire, pulls back the plastic and opens the first drawer. The files are labelled by year and project code. Project Crossglass, that is the name. Running from 1955 through the early 2000s in the first 3 cabinets. The 4th cabinet contains something different. Printouts. Recent ones. From automated monitoring equipment that is still running on backup power in a concealed sensor array somewhere in the building. He reads through the night. Project Crossglass was not built to close the rift or to prevent people from entering it. It was built to use it. The early phase of the project, from the mid-1950s through the early 60s, was pure observation. The team recorded everything that came through the rift and tried to make sense of it. Weather broadcasts, newspaper headlines, radio signals, fragments of audio that gave them glimpses of futures ranging from weeks to decades away. The intelligence value was obvious and immediately appreciated. The second phase, beginning in 1961, was active. Scientists at Station 9 developed a method of using electromagnetic pulses, timed to align with the natural opening conditions, to briefly widen the rift and access cleaner, more sustained transmissions from specific future dates. They could not choose the date precisely, but they could nudge it. They could aim, roughly. And what they heard was used. Not always correctly, not always wisely, but used. Project Crossglass, buried in the mountains of Appalachia under the floor of an abandoned mining office, was a Cold War intelligence operation that ran for decades on the premise that a crack in time could be used as a window into what was coming. Nuclear threats assessed before they materialized. Political instabilities anticipated before they cascaded. Economic shifts predicted before they registered in conventional analysis. Technological developments confirmed before they were announced. And always, always the project kept its central secret, that the rift was real, that it was natural in origin, and that it was growing. The third phase of Project Crossglass is documented in a section of the files that is separately tabbed and written in a different hand from the earlier material. It covers events in 1969. There was a volunteer, a soldier named Private Daniel Hask, 22 years old, from rural Georgia. He signed something that in the files is referred to simply as the waiver and is not reproduced. He wore a biometric monitoring harness and was physically connected to a mechanical tether, a steel cable anchored to the wall of Station 9, threaded through the conduit and out through the hatch and up through the tunnel system and into the forest, emerging at the edge of the crescent zone. He stepped into the rift on a March morning when the conditions were right. Solar activity elevated, barometric pressure dropping, seismic microactivity in the target range. The cable went taut at 4 seconds. The biometric monitors flatlined at 20. The cable went slack at 32 seconds, and then the tether brought him back. Private Daniel Hask returned to Station 9 alive. His vital signs resumed. He was oriented, ambulatory, and able to speak. His clothes were the same. His dog tags were the same. His face was the same. The rest of him was not. He was 50 years older. Not in appearance, though, that too. His hair was white, his hands deeply lined, his eyes carrying the specific quality of someone who has lived a long life and found it at least partly worth living. But in every measurable biological marker, the man who returned through the rift was 50 years older than the man who entered it. He was conscious and coherent for 3 hours. His final recorded words are in the file, transcribed by Martha Ellison, who had been brought back to Station 9 for the test. You opened it too early. The door was supposed to be a door, not a drain. You don't know what you've started accumulating on the other side. It's not dangerous yet. It will be. The town is the first weak point. There are others. Don't go back in. Promise me you don't send anyone else back in. He died 3 hours after returning. The cause of death was listed in internal documents as organ failure consistent with extreme old age. His body was cremated. His service record was classified. Project Crossglass was officially suspended. The rift was not closed, because no one knew how. The fourth cabinet, the recent printouts, the automated sensor array that no one has turned off because no one wants to be responsible for turning it off. Caleb finds them in the early hours of the morning, his eyes burning from the hours of reading under the light of a headlamp, and he understands almost immediately what he's looking at. The sensor array has been running for years without human review. It logs atmospheric conditions, rift activity indicators, the clock desynchronizations, the thermal anomalies, the low-frequency audio signatures, and flags events against a set of threshold parameters established decades ago. Most of the printouts are routine. Most of the pages are unremarkable. And then, 3 days after Evan Mallory vanished, the sensor array picks up a human voice transmission from inside the rift zone. It is logged, dated, time-stamped. Caleb reads the transcription that the automated system has generated. Imperfect, rough, captured from low-frequency audio at marginal signal quality. And his hands go completely still on the page. Tell them I can see the town, but no one can see me. I can see the diner from here. I can see the church. Tell them the light is different, but it's still Black Hollow. I don't know what year it is here. Tell them I'm okay. I'm okay. I just can't find the door back. The voice is identified by secondary audio markers, vocal frequency, cadence, a specific speech pattern, as consistent with Evan Mallory. He's somewhere inside the rift. He is alive. He is looking for the way home. Caleb sits in the station for a long time after reading this. Long enough that the headlamp battery begins to dim. Long enough that the sounds of the forest above him, muffled through the earth and concrete and steel, take on a different quality. Less like background noise, more like the breathing of something patient. He is a scientist. He has spent his career building arguments out of evidence and submitting them to scrutiny. He does not take leaps. He tests hypotheses. He requires reproducibility. He distrusts his own intuitions when his intuitions outrun his data. But here is what he knows. The rift is real. He has seen it, measured it, documented it, and had his documentation seized by people who already knew exactly what it was and how dangerous the knowledge of it could be. People have passed through it, some accidentally, some intentionally, some have returned, some are still on the other side, alive, looking for a way back. The government has known about this for 7 decades and has used it, experimented on it, accidentally widened it, and then sealed the information and walked away from the problem without solving it. And his name is at the bottom of his grandfather's list, which means his grandfather knew somehow at some point that Caleb would end up here, and did not try to prevent it, did not burn the files, did not destroy the documents, left them in a box with a map and a sealed envelope, and trusted that when the time came, the right person would be in the right place to do whatever needed to be done. He begins going through the cross-glass files a second time, faster now, more focused, looking not for the story of what happened but for the answer to a specific question. What, in the decades of study these scientists conducted, did they learn about how the rift can be closed? The answer, when he finds it, is both simpler and more devastating than he expected. The deepest files, the ones in the 4th drawer of the 3rd cabinet, filed under a label that reads simply Provenance Assessment, contain material that no one was meant to find quickly. They are written in a dry technical register that seems designed to keep the most extraordinary facts from registering at first reading. But when you read them carefully, when you follow the citation chains back to their sources, what they reveal is this. The government did not discover the rift at Black Hollow in 1954. They were directed to it. Station 9's founding coordinates, the precise location of the monitoring site, the depth of the hatch, the orientation of the sensor arrays, came from a document that arrived at a government research office in the spring of 1954. The document was transmitted through a communications channel that was not supposed to be active. The originating address was in code. When the code was broken, it resolved to a date. Not a date in the past, but a date in the future. The date is in 2041. A future version of this government, or something that described itself as such, had sent coordinates and instructions backward through the rift, telling the past where to build the station that would monitor and study the anomaly. The memo that analyses this discovery, written in the early 1980s by a Station 9 analyst, who has by that point spent most of her career staring into the implications of the project, ends with 3 sentences that are underlined twice and bracketed with asterisks in red pen. We did not begin this project because we found the rift. We began this project because the future told us to, and every experiment we have conducted since has made the rift larger. The station was not built to study the problem. The station is the problem. Every observation changed the future. Private Hask had said something was accumulating on the other side. Every time Station 9 widened the rift to listen, it let something out, or let something in, or changed the conditions at the boundary in some way that the future had already predicted and had desperately tried to prevent by ensuring that the station was built in the first place. The cover-up was not simply about hiding a time anomaly from the public. It was about hiding the fact that the government had created the crisis it was claiming to manage. The rift at Black Hollow was natural, ancient, probably harmless in its original state, a geological quirk, a place where the layers of time sat slightly too close together, like pages in a very old book pressed so long that they began to stick. Project Crossglass had turned it into a wound. Dawn is still an hour away when Caleb makes his decision. The remaining resonance equipment, old, backup, partial, is still connected to the station's power supply. The documentation tells him exactly how it was used. The frequency settings, the pulse sequences, the timing protocols aligned to natural rift activity. He knows enough to run it in reverse, to use the resonance system not to widen the rift, but to interrupt the electromagnetic conditions that keep it artificially amplified. To take away the thing that Station 9 has been feeding it for decades and let it return, if such a thing is possible, to whatever it was before anyone found it. But he also knows what this may mean for the people on the other side. If the rift closes, if the artificial amplification that has kept it wide and active is removed and the boundary seals, then everyone currently trapped on the other side remains there. Evan Mallory remains there. The missing locals, the old military volunteers, the accidental crossings going back to 1954, they remain there. And he does not know what there is. He has seen it, the ruined future of Black Hollow. But he does not know if the people on the other side are in that specific future, or scattered across multiple temporal positions, or somewhere in between, in the uncharted spaces that Private Hask called the place where matter cannot remain intact. He's standing at the equipment panel, his hand on the switch, not yet throwing it, when the station's old speaker system, emergency battery backup running on the same circuit as the sensors, crackles once and goes live. And then the rift, without being triggered by anything Caleb has done, opens. Not wide, not catastrophically, not in the way that seizes whole people and pulls them through without warning. It opens the way it must have opened in its original state, gently, briefly, a narrowing of the distance between one moment and another. The station's thermal camera, still running, still connected, shows it happening in the forest above, and on the monitor, Caleb sees the other side. The ruined version of Black Hollow is clearly visible through the rift's opening. Collapsed buildings, cracked roads, trees growing through what were once walls and windows. The abandoned town of a possible future, carrying the weight of years that no one living here now has yet had to bear. But it is not empty. There are people standing in it. Not many. Perhaps 40. Perhaps 50. Standing in the street of the ruined town, in the space between the collapsed hardware store and the overgrown churchyard, in the uncertain grey light of a morning that belongs to a year Caleb cannot name. Some of them are wearing modern clothes, jeans, boots, fleece jackets, the practical wardrobe of mountain town life in the present day. Some of them are wearing older clothes, the heavy wool and canvas of earlier decades. 2 or 3 are in what looks like military dress from the 1960s. Some are children. They are all looking at the rift. They can see it. They can see through it, the way Caleb can see through it. They are looking at the station monitor, at the forest around the station entrance, at the thin line of late winter dark that surrounds this building on the present side of the boundary. Caleb scans the faces on the monitor. He finds Evan Mallory almost immediately. The boy is toward the back of the group, taller than some of the others, looking at the opening with an expression that is not fear and not hope, but something between them. The face of a person who has been waiting long enough to have moved past hope into something quieter and more durable. And then, at the front of the group, standing a little apart from the others, in the way of a man who is used to standing a little apart from things, Caleb sees his grandfather, Colonel James Rourke, not 91, not aged, not the man who died 3 months ago in a hospital bed in Virginia. The man standing on the other side of the rift is in his mid-50s, wearing the same grey coat that appears in the photographs from the mining office, looking at Caleb with an expression of recognition that is unmistakable and unnerving. He says something. The station's audio pickup catches it, faint and slightly warped by the distance and the boundary, but audible. "Don't close it. This is the only door left." And Caleb's hand, hovering over the switch, stays where it is. What happens next is not in the files. There are no more official documents to consult, no more memos, no more sealed envelopes, no more instructions from future governments transmitted backward through geological anomalies in the mountains of Appalachia. Whatever Caleb does in that station in the hour before dawn, he does on his own, with the evidence he has gathered, the understanding he has built, and the voice of a grandfather who has been waiting on the other side of a door for reasons that Caleb is only beginning to understand. The official record in the weeks that follow is clean and simple. Dr. Caleb Rourke submits his resignation to the university. He cites personal reasons. He cancels his lease, closes his local accounts, and notifies his department that he will not be returning. His colleagues remember him as brilliant and somewhat difficult, and are not enormously surprised by his departure. His apartment is eventually cleaned out by a property management company, and his belongings are donated. No one files a missing person report. In Black Hollow, the old mining office is fenced off 2 weeks later, under a county order citing structural hazard. A small sign is posted on the fence. The sign says the area is closed pending evaluation. The evaluation, if it is ever conducted, produces no public report. The ridge remains restricted. The rift remains active. But the town begins to change, slowly, subtly, in the ways that small towns in isolated mountain valleys always change, gradually enough that no single person can point to the moment it began, but clearly enough, in retrospect, that everyone will agree something shifted. A road sign on the north end of Main Street has a different name than it did before. Not drastically different, just different enough that people who have lived here for decades occasionally stop in front of it and stand for a moment with a slightly unfamiliar expression, as though they are trying to place a face they know they should know. The old diner that burned down 11 years ago is open again, not rebuilt, not renovated, open, the same sign, the same menu visible through the same window, the same woman behind the counter who has not been there for 11 years, and who, when asked about the fire, says she doesn't know what anyone is talking about and offers to pour a coffee. A family on the south end of town who have 3 children begin, in the space of about a week, to remember having 2. Not unanimously. The parents remember 3. The neighbours who have known them for a decade remember 2. The school records are unclear in a way that the school secretary, when asked, attributes to a clerical error that she cannot quite explain. The clocks in certain houses, older houses, houses on the north side of town, houses that have stood long enough to have layers of old wallpaper under the new paint, occasionally stop at 2:16 a.m. Not all of them, not every night, but enough that the residents of those houses begin, without discussing it, to set their alarms for 2:15 and lie awake until 2:17, listening. And sometimes, from somewhere past the fire tower, past the crescent zone, past the restricted fence around the old mining office, from somewhere in the direction of Dead Bell Ridge, people hear a bell ringing. A single bell. Clear and resonant and carrying across the valley with the ease of something that belongs there. Something that has always been there. Something that this mountain has been ringing for longer than anyone knows, and will continue to ring long after anyone is left to hear it. There is no church on Dead Bell Ridge. There never was. There is no explanation for the bell. There never has been. The official files on Black Hollow say the ground is unstable, mining history, seismic sensitivity, not recommended for development or extended habitation above the valley floor. The county records list the ridge as restricted access. The Federal Geological Survey lists the area as a point of historical interest related to mineral rights litigation from the 1950s, closed to public inquiry. The locals will tell you, if you ask them on the right day at the right hour in the right place, that the mountain swallows people. They will say it matter-of-factly the way you say that a road is icy in winter or a river floods in spring. A natural property of the terrain, something to account for and work around. They are not entirely right about this, because swallowing implies consumption, implies an end, implies that what goes in is gone. The mountain does not consume the people who pass through the rift at Black Hollow. It misplaces them. There is a difference, and it matters enormously, though it is cold comfort on a practical level. The difference is this. What is consumed cannot be found. What is misplaced is somewhere. It exists. It occupies a position. It is looking for the address it belongs to the moment it came from, the door that will bring it back to where it started. Most of what is misplaced finds its way home eventually. The mountains are patient with these things. They have been keeping track for a very long time. Close your eyes now if they aren't already closed. Let the shapes of this story settle in around you, the way the fog settles in around Black Hollow. The ruined town on the other side of the door, the bell that rings from a church that was never built, the clocks that stop at the same minute every night, the people who are somewhere instead of nowhere, looking for the window that lets them back in. Time is stranger than we give it credit for. Not strange in the frightening way. Strange in the way of something vast and patient and fundamentally indifferent to how we experience it. We move through it in one direction, and assume that the direction is the only one available. We make our maps of what came before and our projections of what comes next, and we call this knowledge, and mostly it serves us well enough. But there are places in this world, and physics, honest physics, does not entirely foreclose the possibility, where the layers sit closer together than elsewhere, where a particular confluence of geology and electromagnetism and pressure and solar weather creates conditions that allow adjacent moments to briefly touch, where the past and the future are not separated by the irreversible arrow of entropy, but by something thinner, something almost permeable, something that, if you stood in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, you could step through. Black Hollow is a story. Everything in it is invented. The ridge, the station, the Rourke family, the rift. All of it is fiction, built for you out of the space between what science allows and what imagination reaches for. But the feeling it leaves behind, the sense that somewhere, in some mountain valley in some quiet part of the world, something old and complicated and patient is still happening. That feeling is yours to keep. Carry it lightly, it's not heavy. It just lasts a long time. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep creating these deep dives into the unexplained. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. If this is your first time here and you're enjoying the content, consider subscribing. It means everything. A huge thank you to Stuart for suggesting tonight's topic. This is one of those stories that gets under your skin, not because of what happened, but because of what should not have been possible. Sometimes the most disturbing encounters are not with lights in the sky. They're with people who should not exist. There are cases in UFO research that defy simple categorization. Some involve physical evidence, others involve mass sightings. But there's a third category, quieter and more personal, that involves something far stranger. Contact after the encounter. Not from investigators, not from journalists, but from individuals who claim to represent authority while providing no evidence of it. Individuals whose presence feels staged, whose words feel scripted, and whose very existence leaves no trace once they're gone. This is the story of a man who called himself Ingrid Cold, a man who appeared after a UFO sighting in rural North Carolina, a man who asked questions he already seemed to know the answers to, a man who spoke with the detachment of someone reading from a script they didn't write, and then, just as suddenly as he arrived, he vanished. No records, no follow-up, no proof he was ever real. Who was Ingrid Cold? And more importantly, what was he? This case sits at a crossroads. It connects the classic Men in Black phenomena of the 1950s with the modern era of UFO disclosure. It involves a credible witness who never sought fame. It includes details that resist rational explanation while avoiding the sensational, and at its centre stands a figure who may not have been a figure at all, but rather something else, something that understood how to wear a human face but hadn't quite mastered what goes on behind it. Chapter 1. The encounter that changed everything. To understand the man who called himself Ingrid Cold, we first have to understand the event that preceded him. We need to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like. Because this story is not about lights in the sky. It's about what happens when those lights decide to come closer. January 2007. Rural North Carolina. The landscape outside Fayetteville is flat and quiet. It's the kind of place where the night sky spreads wide and uninterrupted, where the only lights come from scattered farmhouses and the occasional passing car on distant roads. The air in January carries a particular kind of cold, the damp chill that seeps through clothing and settles into bones. Chris Bledsoe was not someone looking for attention. He was a businessman, a family man, living a relatively ordinary life in the quiet farmland that stretched for miles in every direction. He had no history of UFO interest, no background in conspiracy theories, no reason to fabricate what was about to happen. His life was structured around the normal concerns of a man in his position: business dealings, family obligations, the small daily rhythms that make up a life. He was by all accounts grounded, practical, not the type to see things that weren't there. On a cold evening in mid-January, Bledsoe and several family members decided to go fishing along the Cape Fear River. It was supposed to be a simple outing, a chance to relax, a break from the stresses that had been building in his professional life. The river at that time of year runs dark and cold, reflecting what little light reaches it from the winter sky. They set up their fishing gear as the sun began to set. The temperature was dropping, the kind of evening where you can see your breath, where sound carries differently in the cold air. Everything was normal, routine, the kind of peaceful evening that happens 1,000 times across the country without incident. What happened instead would alter the trajectory of his entire existence. According to Bledsoe's account, the first indication that something was wrong came not from sight, but from feeling. A change in the atmosphere, a pressure that seemed to build without source. The kind of sensation you might get before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds, no wind, just a sudden, inexplicable tension in the air itself. And then they saw the lights, not distant points, not airplanes, not helicopters or drones or any conventional aircraft. These were large, structured objects moving in ways that defied conventional explanation. They appeared over the tree line, silent at first, massive in scale. The light they emitted was unlike anything from a normal source. It didn't scatter or diffuse the way artificial light does. It seemed almost solid, as though the light itself had substance. They hovered, not like helicopters, which create visible disturbance in the air but with absolute stillness. And then they moved. Not gradually, not with the physics of objects bound by inertia and mass, but instantaneously. One moment stationary, the next moment elsewhere, with no transition between positions. Bledsoe described the experience as overwhelming, not just visually but emotionally. He felt drawn to the objects, compelled, as though something was communicating with him on a level beyond language, beyond conscious thought. It was a feeling of being seen, recognized, acknowledged by something vast and incomprehensible. His son was with him, his father, other family members, they all saw it. This was not a solitary experience that could be dismissed as hallucination or misperception. Multiple witnesses, multiple perspectives, all describing the same impossible thing. The encounter lasted hours. Time seemed to behave strangely. Moments that felt like minutes stretched into longer periods. Other spans of time seemed to compress or disappear entirely. It's a common element in high strangeness cases, this distortion of temporal perception, as though whatever was happening existed partially outside the normal flow of time. At one point, according to Bledsoe's account, the objects came closer, close enough that he could see detail, structure. The light didn't illuminate like a searchlight or spotlight. It simply existed, emanating from surfaces that seemed to shift and reconfigure. He described feeling paralyzed, not physically restrained, but unable to move, as though his body had forgotten how to respond to commands from his mind. And then there was the emotional component, an overwhelming sense of awe mixed with terror. The recognition that he was in the presence of something so far beyond human understanding that the normal categories of experience no longer applied. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. When the encounter finally ended, when the objects departed as suddenly and silently as they had arrived, Bledsoe found himself sitting on the cold ground, disoriented and emotionally shattered. His family members were similarly affected. Some were crying. Others sat in stunned silence. All of them knew they had witnessed something that would change them forever. The drive home was quiet. What do you say after experiencing something like that? How do you process an encounter that defies every framework you've built for understanding reality? Bledsoe couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lights, felt the presence. The experience had opened. Something in his mind, a door that couldn't be closed. He lay in the darkness of his bedroom, listening to the ordinary sounds of his house, and feeling profoundly displaced from the normal world. He had no framework for what he had witnessed, no explanation that made sense. He knew what he had seen was real with a certainty that bypassed doubt. But that certainty brought no comfort, because if it was real, then everything he thought he understood about the world was incomplete. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was real. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he lay awake that night, was that the encounter was not over. It was only beginning. Because 3 days later, someone knocked on his door. Someone who should not have known what happened. Someone who had no reason to be there. Someone who called himself Ingrid Cold. Chapter 2. The visitor arrives. 3 days after the sighting, Chris Bledsoe was trying to return to normal life. Trying and failing. He had told a few close friends about the encounter. Their reactions ranged from concern to polite skepticism. Some suggested he see a professional. Others changed the subject quickly, uncomfortable with territory that challenged their worldview. It was an isolating experience, to have witnessed something profound and find no one willing to engage with it seriously. He was in his living room when he heard the knock. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of time when unexpected visitors are unusual. The knock itself was formal. 3 precise raps. Not the casual knock of a friend or neighbour, something more official. When Bledsoe opened the door, he found a man standing on his porch. The first thing he noticed was the suit. It was dark, nearly black, but with a faint sheen that suggested synthetic material rather than quality wool. The cut was oddly generic, as though ordered from a catalogue that hadn't updated its designs in decades. Not quite contemporary, not quite vintage, just slightly wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. The man himself was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, average build. His face had the kind of generic quality that makes it difficult to recall specific features. Later, when Bledsoe tried to describe him to others, he found himself struggling. Was his hair brown or dark blonde? Were his eyes blue or grey? The details seemed to slip away even as he tried to grasp them. But the expression was unforgettable. Blank. Neutral. Not the way someone looks when they're trying to appear neutral, but genuinely empty of affect. His face was like a default setting. No smile lines, no furrows from concentration or worry. Just smooth, unmarked neutrality. The man introduced himself. "My name is Ingrid Cold," he said. His voice was measured, each word given equal weight and spacing. There was no regional accent, no particular inflection, just words delivered with mechanical precision. "I represent a government agency," he continued. "I would like to ask you some questions about the incident that occurred 3 days ago." He did not specify which agency. He offered no identification, no badge, no credentials of any kind. He simply stood there, waiting for Bledsoe's response with that same blank expression. There was something about his demeanour that suggested authority. Not aggressive authority, the kind that demands compliance, but the subtler kind that comes from bureaucratic power. The kind that doesn't need to justify itself because it operates from a position of assumed legitimacy. Bledsoe hesitated. Every instinct told him something was off. But there was also a part of him that wanted answers. If this man represented the government, perhaps there was an explanation. Perhaps what he had witnessed was part of some classified program. Perhaps there was a rational framework after all. "How did you know about the incident?" Bledsoe asked. Ingrid Cold's expression didn't change. "We monitor unusual aerial phenomena," he said. "May I come inside?" The phrasing was strange, formal to the point of being antiquated, and the way he asked permission felt rehearsed, as though he had been taught that this was the appropriate protocol, but didn't understand the social nuance behind it. Bledsoe stepped aside and let him in. Ingrid Cold entered with precise movements. He didn't glance around the room the way a normal visitor would, taking in the space and orienting himself. He simply walked to the nearest chair and sat down. His posture was rigid, perfectly vertical, hands placed symmetrically on his knees. "Please sit," he said to Bledsoe, even though it was Bledsoe's own living room. Bledsoe sat. What followed was one of the strangest interviews Bledsoe had ever experienced. Ingrid Cold began asking questions. The questions themselves were straightforward enough. What time had the encounter occurred? How many objects had he seen? What had he felt during the experience? Had anyone else witnessed it? But the delivery was what made it strange. Each question was asked in the same measured tone. There was no variation in pitch or rhythm, no emphasis on certain words, just a flat mechanical recitation of questions that felt like they were being read from a list. And there was no follow-up. In a normal conversation, when someone asks a question and receives an answer, they respond to that answer. They might ask for clarification. They might express surprise or interest. They might pivot to a related question based on what they've learned. Ingrid Cold did none of this. He asked a question. Bledsoe answered. Cold moved to the next question. There was no sense of an actual conversation taking place. It was more like a form being filled out, data being collected without context or comprehension. Bledsoe found himself increasingly unsettled. The man across from him didn't react to anything he said, didn't nod in understanding, didn't write anything down. He simply listened with that blank expression, as though recording the information through some internal process that required no external notation. At one point, Bledsoe attempted to ask his own questions. "Which agency do you work for exactly?" Ingrid Cold paused for a fraction of a second as though processing the query. "That is not relevant to this interview," he said. "Why are you interested in what I saw?" Another pause. "We gather data on unexplained phenomena." The answers were evasive without being obviously deceptive. They provided just enough information to seem like responses while revealing nothing substantive. And there was something else Bledsoe noticed. Ingrid Cold never blinked. Not once during the entire conversation. His eyes remained fixed, unmoving, locked onto Bledsoe with an intensity that felt more like observation than human attention. The interview lasted roughly 30 minutes. Toward the end, Cold asked a question that made Bledsoe's skin prickle. "Did the objects communicate with you?" Bledsoe hadn't mentioned anything about communication. He had described seeing lights, feeling overwhelmed, but he hadn't talked about the sense of contact, of being acknowledged by something intelligent. "What makes you think they communicated?" Bledsoe asked carefully. "It is a standard question," Cold replied, but the timing of it, the specificity suggested otherwise. When the questions finally ended, Ingrid Cold stood up with the same precise movements he had used to sit down. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Will someone be in touch?" Bledsoe asked. "Is there going to be an investigation?" "That will be determined through appropriate channels," Cold said. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside without looking back. Bledsoe followed him to the porch, wanting to ask more questions, wanting some kind of concrete information about what happened next. But when he reached the door, Ingrid Cold was already gone. Not walking down the driveway, not getting into a car, just gone. The driveway was empty, the street was quiet. It was as though the man had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped off the porch. Bledsoe stood there in the cold afternoon air, staring at the empty space where a man had been moments before, and felt a creeping dread settle over him. No business card, no contact information, no mention of when or if anyone would return. He went back inside and sat down in the same chair where he had been questioned. The room felt normal again. The ordinary afternoon light filtered through the windows. The familiar sounds of his house resumed their regular patterns, but nothing felt normal anymore. Chapter 3. Something Feels Wrong. It wasn't until after Ingrid Cold left that the full weight of the encounter began to settle on Chris Bledsoe. In the immediate aftermath, he had been too focused on answering questions, too caught up in the moment to fully process what was happening. But now, in the silence of his own living room, the strangeness of it crystallized. He had been visited by a man claiming to represent the government. But which part of the government? What agency? And why had he offered no proof of his identity? Bledsoe had dealt with government officials before. Business permits, tax issues, the routine interactions of running a company, and in every single instance credentials had been presented. Identification had been offered. There was always a paper trail, a business card, some physical evidence that the interaction had occurred. In any legitimate investigation, this is standard protocol. Law enforcement officers show their badges, federal agents present identification, even survey takers carry laminated credentials. It's how trust is established. It's how authority is verified. Ingrid Cold had provided nothing. Bledsoe began replaying the conversation in his mind. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Details that had seemed merely odd in the moment now appeared profoundly wrong. Ingrid Cold's speech had been oddly formal, almost archaic in its construction. He had said things like, "May I come inside?" instead of "Can I come in?" He had used phrases like, "That will be determined through appropriate channels," when a normal person might have just said, "I don't know," or "I'll have to check." It was the kind of language you might find in an old government manual, bureaucratic phrasing from a different era. As though someone had learned how officials were supposed to speak, but was working from outdated source material. He didn't use contractions, didn't say "I'm," or "that's," or "we're." Every word was fully enunciated, every sentence complete and formal. It was technically correct English, but it lacked the natural flow and rhythm of actual human speech, and there had been no small talk, none at all. Normal human interactions, even formal ones, include some element of casual communication, a comment about the weather, an apology for the intrusion, some acknowledgement of the social context. Ingrid Cold had offered nothing. No pleasantries, no moments of casual human interaction. It was as though he had been programmed to ask specific questions and nothing more. Any deviation from that program resulted in those strange pauses, those moments where he seemed to be processing before delivering his next scripted line. His movements, too, had felt rehearsed. Bledsoe remembered how Cold had sat, perfectly rigid, spine straight, hands placed with geometric precision on his knees. He hadn't shifted position once during the entire conversation, hadn't crossed his legs, hadn't adjusted his posture. He had simply maintained that same rigid position as though locked into place, and the eye contact, that unblinking stare. In normal conversation, people's eyes move. They glance away briefly. They blink. They show the unconscious movements that come with thinking and processing. Ingrid Cold's eyes had remained fixed, unmoving, locked onto Bledsoe with an intensity that suggested observation rather than engagement. It was like being watched by a camera that happened to be shaped like a person. There was also the matter of his name, Ingrid Cold. Bledsoe repeated it to himself, letting the syllables roll around in his mind. It didn't sound like a real name. It sounded constructed, artificial, like a name someone might use if they needed a name but didn't understand how names actually worked. Ingrid is traditionally a Scandinavian name, most commonly given to women. For a man to have that name was unusual but not impossible. But paired with Cold as a surname, it took on an almost allegorical quality. Cold, emotionless, detached, distant. Was it a real name, or was it a designation? A code that meant something specific within whatever system Ingrid Cold operated from? Bledsoe tried to recall if Cold had shown any personal characteristics at all, any detail that might indicate he was an actual person with an actual life. But there was nothing. No wedding ring, no watch, no pen in his pocket, no phone clipped to his belt, nothing to suggest a life beyond this single interaction. It was as though Ingrid Cold had been assembled specifically for this encounter and would be disassembled once it was complete. And there was something else. Something Bledsoe couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply in his gut. Ingrid Cold's presence had felt wrong, not threatening in an aggressive way but fundamentally off. Like watching an actor play a role they didn't fully understand. Someone going through the motions of being human without grasping what being human actually means. The uncanny valley. That's what psychologists call it. The sense of wrongness we feel when something appears almost human but isn't quite right. A mannequin in dim light, a very realistic robot, something that mimics humanity closely enough to trigger our social recognition systems but not quite perfectly enough to be convincing. Ingrid Cold had existed in that valley, close enough to human to pass at first glance. But upon reflection, upon careful consideration of all the small details, fundamentally wrong. Bledsoe stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon was peaceful. His neighbours' houses sat quiet in the fading light. Cars passed on the distant road. Everything was normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been interviewed by something that was only pretending to be a person, and that pretense had not been entirely successful. Chapter 4. Knowledge He Shouldn't Have. In the weeks following the visit, Chris Bledsoe tried to return to his normal life. He went to work. He interacted with his family. He attempted to file away the experience as just another strange element of an already strange situation. But he couldn't, because strange things kept happening. Small things at first, synchronicities that could be dismissed as coincidence. He would think about the encounter and the phone would ring. He would decide to research UFO phenomena online, and his internet would disconnect. His electronics began behaving erratically, computers freezing, phones dropping calls, the television switching channels on its own. These could all be explained rationally. Technology malfunctions, random chance, confirmation bias. But the frequency and timing of these events created a pattern that was hard to ignore. And then there were the predictions. During their conversation, Ingrid Cold had made certain statements. At the time, Bledsoe hadn't paid much attention to them. They had seemed like generic observations, vague comments that could apply to almost anyone. But then those statements started coming true. Cold had mentioned that Bledsoe would face professional difficulties in the coming months. At the time, Bledsoe's business was stable. There was no indication of problems, but within weeks, deals began falling through. Clients became unreachable. Financial pressures mounted in ways that seemed to come from nowhere. Cold had mentioned that Bledsoe would have difficulty sleeping. Another generic statement that could apply to almost anyone under stress. But Bledsoe began experiencing severe insomnia. Not the normal kind where you have trouble falling asleep. This was different. He would lie awake for hours, feeling completely alert, as though sleep itself had become impossible. And when he did finally drift off, his dreams were vivid and disturbing. Cold had asked if Bledsoe would be speaking to researchers about his experience. At the time, Bledsoe had no plans to do so, but within a month, he found himself being contacted by UFO investigators who had somehow learned about his encounter. People he had never met, people who claimed to have heard about his experience through channels he couldn't identify. How had they known? He had told only a few close friends. He had not filed any reports. He had not contacted any organizations. And yet researchers were showing up, asking questions, wanting details. It was as though his experience had been logged somewhere, catalogued in some system that certain people had access to, a system that existed outside official channels. But the most disturbing prediction was the most specific. During their conversation, Cold had made an odd comment about Bledsoe's family. He had said, almost casually, "Your son will also have encounters." At the time, Bledsoe hadn't known how to respond to that. It wasn't framed as a question. It was stated as a fact, as though Cold was not predicting the future, but reading from a timeline that had already been written. 6 weeks later, Bledsoe's son reported seeing lights identical to the ones they had witnessed together. But this time, his son was alone. And this time, the encounter was even closer, more intense, more personally directed. How could Ingrid Cold have known that would happen? How could he have predicted specific future events in the lives of people he had never met before? If Cold was simply a government investigator, his knowledge made no sense. There had been no surveillance in place before the first encounter. No reason for any agency to be monitoring the Bledsoe family. They were ordinary citizens living ordinary lives, unless the government had been monitoring them before the encounter. unless they had known something was going to happen, unless the UFO phenomenon itself was connected to some kind of predictive system that allowed authorities to anticipate sightings before they occurred. That possibility was disturbing enough. But there was another interpretation, one that Bledsoe tried not to think about but couldn't entirely dismiss. What if Ingrid Cold wasn't there to gather information? What if he was there to confirm what he already knew? Not because he had access to surveillance systems or classified databases, but because he was part of the same phenomenon as the lights themselves. What if he hadn't been sent to investigate a UFO encounter? What if he was part of the UFO encounter? An extension of whatever intelligence had appeared in the sky 3 days earlier? That would explain his impossible knowledge. It would explain why he spoke as though reading from a script. It would explain the lack of credentials, the absence of records, the strange behaviour. Because he wasn't a government agent at all. He was something else. Something that understood it needed to appear as a government agent, but didn't quite know how to execute that appearance convincingly. Bledsoe kept these thoughts to himself. He knew how they sounded. Paranoid, conspiratorial, the kind of thinking that gets people dismissed as unstable. But he also couldn't ignore what he had experienced. The encounter was real. Ingrid Cold was real. The predictions that came true were real. And somewhere in that reality was a truth that resisted. Conventional explanation. This is where the encounter shifts from strange to genuinely unsettling. Because if Ingrid Cold was simply an investigator, his knowledge could potentially be explained. Maybe he had conducted surveillance. Maybe he had interviewed others who were present. Maybe he had access to classified monitoring systems that tracked UFO phenomena. But if he wasn't an investigator, if he was something else entirely, then his knowledge suggests something far more disturbing. That he wasn't there to gather information. He was there to let Bledsoe know he was being watched. To establish that the encounter was not over. To make it clear that whatever had appeared in the sky that night had not simply observed and left. It had marked him, and it would be back. Chapter 5. The Men in Black Parallel. The story of Ingrid Cold does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger, much older pattern. A pattern that stretches back to the earliest days of modern UFO research and continues into the present day. A pattern that involves strange visitors who appear after sightings and leave witnesses more confused than enlightened. They are called the Men in Black. The phenomenon has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that the term itself has lost much of its original strangeness. Movies and television shows have turned the Men in Black into government agents, secret organisation members, even aliens disguised as humans. The Hollywood version is slick, professional, equipped with advanced technology. But the original reports, the ones that emerged in the 1950s and 60s, describe something far stranger and more unsettling. Something that fits the Ingrid Cold encounter with disturbing precision. The first widely documented case involved a man named Albert Bender. In 1953, Bender was running a UFO research organisation called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He was investigating sightings, collecting data, building a network of researchers and witnesses, and then one day 3 men in dark suits showed up at his door. According to Bender's account, these men knew details about his research that should have been private. They spoke in strange, formal language. They made veiled threats about what would happen if he continued his investigations. And then they left, vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. Bender was terrified. He shut down his organisation, he stopped researching UFOs entirely, and for years he refused to discuss what had happened. When he finally did write about the encounter, his description of the visitors was deeply unsettling. They weren't quite human, he suggested. They moved strangely, their voices sounded wrong, their eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him, and their presence triggered a visceral fear response that went beyond normal intimidation. In the decades that followed, similar reports multiplied. UFO witnesses across the country began describing visits from strange men in dark suits who showed up unannounced in the days or weeks following sightings. The pattern was remarkably consistent. They arrived unannounced, usually within days of a UFO encounter. No phone calls beforehand, no appointments scheduled, they simply appeared. They claimed to represent government agencies but provided no credentials. Sometimes they flashed badges too quickly to examine. Other times they offered nothing at all. They operated from assumed authority without proving that authority existed. They asked questions in a detached, emotionless manner. Witnesses described their speech as robotic, mechanical, as though reciting from a script. The conversations felt rehearsed, artificial, lacking the natural flow of human interaction. They displayed behaviours that seemed slightly out of sync with normal human interaction. Some reports described men in black who didn't seem to understand how doors worked, reaching for handles in awkward ways. Others mentioned visitors who sat too rigidly, moved too precisely, spoke in patterns that felt programmed rather than spontaneous. They wore clothing that seemed slightly out of date, dark suits that looked like they came from an earlier era, hats that hadn't been fashionable in decades, ties and shoes that suggested someone's idea of how authority figures should dress based on outdated information. And then they vanished, leaving no trace of their existence. No one could track them back to any agency. No one could verify their identities. They existed only in the moment of encounter and then dissolved back into whatever void they had emerged from. Some witnesses reported even stranger details. Men in black who seemed confused by ordinary objects, who asked bizarre questions about mundane things, who appeared to be learning about human culture in real time. One famous account from the 1960s involved a woman who offered her men in black visitors a glass of water. According to her report, they stared at the glasses with apparent confusion before attempting to drink. One of them tried to consume the water by holding the glass against his face without opening his mouth, as though he understood the concept of drinking but not the mechanism. These details could be dismissed as embellishment, memory distortion, the tendency of stories to become more elaborate with each retelling, but the consistency across multiple reports, from witnesses who had no contact with each other, is harder to explain, and Ingrid Cold fits this pattern perfectly. He arrived 3 days after a UFO sighting. He claimed government affiliation without providing proof. His demeanour was emotionless and his speech was oddly formal. He asked questions as though following a script. He displayed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed, and then he vanished without a trace. But there's one key difference between Ingrid Cold and the classic Men in Black reports. One detail that makes his case particularly intriguing. Most Men in Black reports involve unnamed individuals. They're described only by appearance and behaviour. No names are given, no identities are claimed. They're anonymous figures who exist only in the role they're playing. But Ingrid Cold introduced himself. He gave a name. Strange as that name might be, it was specific, deliberate. This raises troubling questions. Was Ingrid Cold a real person using a false name? Was the name itself some kind of code or designation? Or was it an attempt by something non-human to create a plausible human identity without fully understanding how human names work? The fact that no records exist for anyone named Ingrid Cold working in any government capacity during that time period suggests the name was fabricated. But why fabricate a name that sounds so obviously wrong? Why not choose something more conventional, more forgettable, unless the wrongness was intentional, unless the name was designed to be remembered? To stick in the mind of the witness and create that sense of unease that makes the encounter unforgettable. In the literature of Men in Black encounters, there's a theory that these visitors are not trying to silence witnesses. If they wanted silence, there are more effective methods. Instead, they seem designed to destabilize, to create confusion and doubt, to make the witness question their own perceptions. By appearing with apparent authority but no proof of authority, they create cognitive dissonance. The witness knows something is wrong but can't quite articulate what. They want to report the encounter, but to whom? The visitors claim to be from the government. How do you report a suspicious government agent to the government? It's a psychological trap, and it's remarkably effective. Chris Bledsoe experienced exactly this. After Ingrid Cold's visit, he attempted to verify the encounter. He called local authorities, he contacted federal agencies, he tried to find any record of an investigation into his sighting, and he found nothing. No one had authorized an interview. No one had sent an investigator. No agency claimed responsibility. The visit had occurred in a bureaucratic void. Officially it never happened, but Bledsoe knew it had happened. He had sat across from Ingrid Cold. He had answered the questions. The encounter was undeniably real. But how do you prove something that leaves no evidence? How do you convince others of an experience that exists only in memory? This is the genius, if we can call it that, of the Men in Black phenomenon. It operates in the space between proof and experience. It's real enough to traumatize the witness, but intangible enough to resist verification. And Ingrid Cold executed this perfectly. Chapter 6. The name itself. Let's spend some time examining the name, because in cases like this, every detail matters. Names are how we identify ourselves, how we establish identity within social structures. They carry cultural weight, family history, personal meaning. Ingrid Cold. Say it out loud. Let the syllables form in your mouth. Notice how they feel, how they sound, the way they combine. There's something fundamentally strange about this name. It doesn't flow naturally. It doesn't have the organic quality that most names possess. It sounds constructed, assembled, like something created by someone who understood that humans have names, but didn't fully grasp the cultural and linguistic patterns that govern how names actually work. Let's start with the first name, Ingrid. Ingrid is a Scandinavian name. It derives from Old Norse and means beautiful or fair. It's traditionally a feminine name, though not exclusively so. It was popular in Scandinavian countries and among Scandinavian immigrant communities in America during the early to mid-20th century. For a man to have the name Ingrid is unusual, not impossible. Names sometimes cross gender boundaries. Parents make unconventional choices. Cultural contexts shift, but it's uncommon enough to be notable. The name also carries a specific cultural and temporal association. It feels like a name from a particular era, the 1930s through the 1950s, the age of Ingrid Bergman and similar cultural figures. It's not a contemporary name, not something you'd expect a government agent in 2007 to possess, unless, of course, that agent was operating from outdated information about human naming conventions, unless whoever or whatever created the identity Ingrid Cold was working from source material that was decades old. Now consider the surname, Cold. Cold is an English surname with Germanic roots. It's uncommon but not unknown. Like many surnames, it likely originated as a descriptive term. Perhaps an ancestor lived in a cold region. Perhaps they had a cold demeanour. Perhaps it was a mistranslation or corruption of another name. But paired with Ingrid, it takes on new meaning. The name becomes allegorical. Ingrid Cold. Cold as in emotionally distant, detached, unfeeling, inhuman. It's almost too perfect. Too on the nose. Like a name chosen to communicate something about the person bearing it. A designation rather than an identity. Some researchers have suggested the name as a code, that Ingrid might refer to a specific program or operation, that Cold might indicate a particular role or function within whatever system deployed this visitor. In intelligence communities, code names are common. Operations are given designations that mean nothing to outsiders, but communicate specific information to those in the know. Could Ingrid Cold be such a designation? A way for one operative to identify themselves to another? Not meant to be a convincing human name, but rather a signal that would be recognised by the right audience. Others believe the name is a translation error. This theory suggests that whatever entity Ingrid Cold truly was, it was attempting to translate its actual designation into human language, and arrived at something that was close but not quite right. Like running a phrase through a faulty translation algorithm and getting output that's technically correct, but sounds wrong to a native speaker. In this interpretation, Ingrid Cold might be the closest English approximation of something that exists in a non-human language or conceptual framework. The entity understood it needed a name. It attempted to generate one, but lacking true understanding of how human names function culturally and linguistically, it produced something that was almost right but fundamentally off. Still others think the name is intentionally unsettling. that it was chosen specifically to create discomfort and doubt in the witness. A psychological tactic designed to make the encounter more memorable and more disturbing. If you want someone to remember an interaction, you give them something that doesn't fit, something that creates cognitive dissonance, something their brain will keep returning to because it can't quite process it correctly. A man with a woman's name, a combination that sounds like allegory, a designation that feels like code. These elements stick in memory. They create that uncanny valley effect. They make the witness question not just the visitor, but their own perception of the encounter. What we know for certain is this. There are no records of anyone named Ingrid Cold working for any known government agency during that time period. No employment records, no public listings, no digital footprint, no paper trail, nothing. In the modern era, this kind of complete absence is almost impossible to achieve. We all leave traces: social security numbers, tax records, employment history, credit reports, online presence. Even people who deliberately try to live off the grid leave some kind of documentation. But Ingrid Cold left nothing. Bledsoe tried to find him, tried to verify his existence through every channel he could think of, and came up empty every single time. It was as though the name existed only in that single conversation, spoken once and then dissolved back into whatever void it had emerged from. The name exists only in Chris Bledsoe's account, only in the testimony of a witness describing an encounter that officially never happened with a person who officially never existed. And that absence is, in its own way, more disturbing than his presence ever was. Because if Ingrid Cold was a real person using a false name, there should still be some trace of the real person, some way to track backwards from the encounter to an actual identity. But there's nothing. If the name was a code, someone in the intelligence community should recognize it. Someone should be able to confirm that yes, this is a designation we use, even if they can't reveal what it means. But no one does. If it was a translation error, there should be similar cases, other witnesses, encountering visitors with equally strange names that suggest attempted translation from non-human frameworks. And while there are strange names in Men in Black reports, none quite match this pattern. The mystery of the name remains unsolved. Like everything else about Ingrid Cold, it exists in that space between rational explanation and genuine anomaly. Close enough to normal to almost make sense. Strange enough to resist any comfortable interpretation. Ingrid Cold. A name that sounds like it should be real but isn't. A designation that might mean everything or nothing. An identity that exists only in the moment of its claiming and nowhere else. Say it again. Ingrid Cold. Feel how the syllables don't quite fit together, how the name creates a small discomfort in the mind. That discomfort is intentional, or it's an accident that reveals deeper truth about the nature of the phenomenon. Either way, it's effective. Because decades from now, when other details of this case have faded, that name will remain. Ingrid Cold. The man who might not have been a man at all. The agent without a file. The visitor who existed only long enough to ask his questions, and then disappeared. Chapter 7. The silence that followed. After Ingrid Cold left Chris Bledsoe's home, walking out the door and vanishing into impossible absence, there was no follow-up. No phone calls, no letters, no second visit, no contact of any kind. This itself was strange, because in any legitimate investigation there's always follow-up. Law enforcement comes back with additional questions as new information emerges. Federal agents maintain contact with witnesses. Even insurance adjusters check in to clarify details. Follow-up is standard procedure. It's how investigations work. You conduct an initial interview, gather preliminary information, and then return with more specific questions once you've had time to analyse what you've learned. But Ingrid Cold never returned, and no one else showed up in his place. Bledsoe waited for days, expecting another knock on the door. He kept his phone close, anticipating a call. He checked his mail for official correspondence. Nothing came. The silence was absolute, as though the interview had been a self-contained event with no connection to any larger process. A data collection mission that began and ended in that single 30-minute conversation. After a week of waiting, Bledsoe decided to take action. He He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong about the encounter. The lack of credentials, the strange behaviour, the impossible knowledge, the name that sounded fake, all of it added up to something that required investigation. So he started making calls. His first attempt was local law enforcement. He called the Fayetteville Police Department and asked if they had sent anyone to interview him about a UFO sighting. The officer who answered the phone was polite but confused. No, they hadn't sent anyone. They don't investigate UFO sightings. That's not within their jurisdiction. Bledsoe tried the county sheriff's office. Same response. No one had been dispatched. They had no record of his incident, and they certainly hadn't sent anyone named Ingrid Cold. He contacted the North Carolina State Police. Again, nothing. No investigation, no record, no agent by that name in their system. Moving up the chain, Bledsoe tried federal agencies, the FBI first. He called their Charlotte field office and explained the situation. A man claiming to represent a government agency had shown up at his home asking questions. The man had provided no identification. Bledsoe wanted to verify if this was legitimate, or if he should be concerned about potential fraud or impersonation. The FBI took his report. They seemed interested, professional. They said someone would look into it and get back to him. No one ever did. He tried the Department of Defense. Surely if there was a program investigating UFO sightings, it would be connected to military intelligence in some way. But navigating the DoD's phone system was like trying to find your way through a maze designed to prevent navigation. He was transferred multiple times, placed on hold for extended periods, eventually disconnected. When he finally reached someone who listened to his story, they told him there was no current program investigating UFO phenomena. That program had ended in the 1960s. If he wanted to file a report, he could contact NASA or the FAA, but the military had no active interest in such cases. Bledsoe tried NASA. They were polite but clear. They study space, not unidentified aerial phenomena. They recommended he contact local law enforcement. Full circle. Back to square one. Every agency passing responsibility to another agency, all of them claiming no knowledge, no involvement, no interest. It was bureaucratic limbo. His encounter existed in a gap between jurisdictions, falling through the cracks of official systems that weren't designed to handle this kind of report. But here's what made it truly unsettling. Ingrid Cold had demonstrated detailed knowledge of Bledsoe's encounter. He had asked specific questions about timing, duration, physical details. He had known things that Bledsoe hadn't shared with anyone outside his immediate family. If no government agency was investigating, how had Cold obtained that information? If there was no active program monitoring UFO phenomena, how had he known about the sighting in the first place? The only logical explanations were disturbing. Either there was a classified program operating outside normal channels, one that denied its own existence even to other government agencies. A black budget operation so compartmentalised that the left hand genuinely didn't know what the right hand was doing. Or Ingrid Cold had never been part of the government at all. He had simply claimed to be, and his knowledge came from some other source entirely, a source that had access to information no human agency could possess. Bledsoe didn't know which explanation was more frightening. He tried one more avenue, Freedom of Information Act requests. If there was any documentation of his case, any official record of an investigation, FOIA requests should surface it. Even if the content was redacted, the existence of files would confirm that something had happened. He filed requests with every agency he could think of: FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, DOD. Each request asked for any and all documents related to his UFO sighting and any subsequent investigations. The responses trickled in over the following months. The FBI found no records. The CIA found no records. The DIA found no records. Every agency came back with the same answer: negative results. No documentation matched his search parameters. It was as though the entire event had occurred outside official reality. The sighting had happened, the visit had happened, but, according to every official system designed to track and document such events, nothing had happened at all. This is where the case moves from strange to officially unsettling. Because in any legitimate government operation, There is documentation. There are records. There is a chain of command. There are forms to fill out, reports to file, databases to update. Even the most highly classified operations leave paper trails. They exist in systems, even if those systems are compartmentalized and access restricted. When the government interviews someone, that interview generates documentation. An agent files a report. The information is logged. The case is assigned a number. It enters the bureaucratic machinery that processes information. But Ingrid Cold left nothing. No report, no case file, no assignment number, no documentation whatsoever. It's almost impossible for a legitimate government agent to operate that way. The entire system is built on documentation. You can't function within the bureaucracy without generating records, unless you're not part of the bureaucracy, unless you're operating entirely outside it, unless you're something that's only pretending to be part of official systems while actually existing in a completely different framework. Bledsoe was not alone in this experience. When he eventually connected with UFO researchers and shared his story, he learned that other witnesses had reported similar patterns. Visits from alleged government agents that left no trace, interviews that were never documented, follow-up that never materialized. The pattern suggested something deliberate. These visitors, whoever or whatever they were, operated in a way that specifically avoided creating documentation. They appeared, they observed, they asked their questions, and then they vanished, leaving the witness to wonder if the encounter was real at all. This is what some researchers call high strangeness, events that are too structured to be, hallucinations but too anomalous to fit within conventional reality, encounters that have the feel of intelligence and purpose, but resist every attempt at verification or documentation. Bledsoe's attempts to verify Ingrid Cold's visit became part of the case itself. The complete absence of records became evidence. Not evidence that it didn't happen, but evidence that something deliberately designed to avoid documentation had happened. And that absence spoke volumes. It suggested intentionality. It suggested a system operating parallel to official systems. It suggested visitors who understood they needed to appear official, without actually being official, who knew exactly how to navigate the gaps in bureaucratic coverage. Or it suggested something that didn't understand bureaucracy at all, that simply mimicked what it thought official authority looked like, without grasping the underlying structures that make such authority real. Either way, the silence that followed Ingrid Cold's visit was not empty. It was full of negative space, full of absences that outlined a presence, full of missing documentation that testified to something that occurred outside documented reality. The phone call stopped. The FOIA requests dried up. Bledsoe eventually accepted that he would never get official confirmation of what had happened. But he knew. He had sat across from Ingrid Cold. He had heard that mechanical voice. He had felt that uncanny presence. The encounter was real, even if every official system insisted it wasn't. Chapter 8. Expansion of the theory. As word of the Ingrid Cold encounter spread through UFO research communities, it began to take on a life of its own. Researchers connected it to other cases. Witnesses came forward with similar experiences. Patterns emerged that suggested this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more complex phenomenon. The story moved beyond simple men in black comparisons. It became a reference point for understanding something deeper about how high strangeness events unfold, about the relationship between the initial encounter and what comes after, about the ways in which contact with the unexplained doesn't end when the lights disappear. One of the most significant frameworks that emerged was the concept of the hitchhiker effect. The term was coined by researchers studying cases where paranormal or anomalous events seemed to follow witnesses long after their initial encounter, as though the experience had opened a door that couldn't be easily closed. The pattern was remarkably consistent across diverse cases. Someone witnesses a UFO. The immediate encounter ends. They return to normal life. And then strange things start happening. Electronic disturbances, devices malfunctioning without explanation, computers behaving erratically, phones receiving calls from numbers that don't exist, sleep disturbances, vivid dreams, night terrors, the sense of being watched while trying to sleep. waking up in positions or locations different from where they went to bed, synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that pile up beyond statistical probability, seeing repeating number patterns, encountering people who mention the exact thing you were just thinking about, experiences that feel orchestrated. And then there were the visitors, not just men in black, though they were certainly part of the pattern, but also other strange figures, people who appeared at odd times, asked bizarre questions, and then disappeared without explanation. In some cases, these visitors claimed to be checking meters or delivering packages, but when the witness looked outside moments later, no vehicle was visible. When they checked with utility companies or delivery services, no one had been dispatched to their address. The hitchhiker effect suggests that UFO encounters are not discrete events. They're not something that happens and then ends. They're more like infections, contaminations. Once you've had contact, you're marked, tagged, and the phenomenon continues to interact with you in ways that are subtle, confusing, and deeply disorienting. Chris Bledsoe's experience fit this pattern perfectly. The UFO encounter on the Cape Fear River was just the beginning. Ingrid Cold's visit was the next phase, and then came everything else. The electronic disturbances. His computers failed at critical moments. His phone would ring and no one would be on the line, or a voice would speak in that same flat, mechanical tone he had heard from Ingrid Cold. The sleep disturbances. He would wake at exactly 3 a.m, night after night, feeling completely alert as though something had woken him deliberately. His dreams became populated with strange figures who asked questions and spoke in formal, archaic language. The continued sightings. The lights appeared again, multiple times, sometimes alone, sometimes with family members present, always with that same sense of being acknowledged, recognised, tracked, and there were more visitors, not always claiming to be government agents, but always appearing unexpectedly and behaving strangely. A man who showed up claiming to be conducting a survey, but asked questions that seemed designed to assess Bledsoe's mental state. A woman who appeared at his workplace asking about the events, without specifying which events she meant. Each encounter added to the sense that he was being observed, monitored, that his life had become an ongoing experiment or observation project run by something that existed just outside his ability to perceive it directly. UFO researchers who studied Bledsoe's case began comparing it to other high-strangeness scenarios. The more they looked, the more patterns emerged. There was the case of John Keel, the researcher who coined the term Men in Black, and documented countless similar encounters during his investigations in the 1960s. Keel himself experienced the hitchhiker effect. The more he researched UFOs, the more strange events occurred in his own life. Phone calls with mysterious voices, letters that appeared in his mailbox without postage, visitors who knew things they shouldn't know. Keel eventually came to believe that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial in the traditional sense. It was something stranger, something that existed alongside human reality, occasionally intersecting with it, manipulating perception, and creating experiences that seemed designed to confuse and destabilize. There was the case of Whitley Strieber, who wrote about his experiences in communion. Strieber described not just alien encounters, but a complete transformation of his reality. Strange visitors, missing time, the sense that his entire life had become permeable to forces he couldn't understand or control. There was the Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon, where researchers documented layer upon layer of high strangeness events. UFO sightings were just the surface. Below that were animal mutilations, poltergeist activity, apparitions, time distortions, and yes, mysterious visitors who appeared on the property without explanation. The common thread through all these cases was that the phenomenon didn't behave like simple extraterrestrial visitation. It behaved like intelligence at play, like something running experiments or tests, like something that wanted to interact with human consciousness in ways that resisted simple categorization. And central to many of these cases were visitors like Ingrid Cold, figures that appeared human but behaved strangely, that claimed authority without providing proof, that demonstrated impossible knowledge and then vanished without trace. Some researchers proposed that these visitors served a specific function. They weren't trying to silence witnesses. If that was the goal, there were more efficient methods. Instead, they seemed designed to destabilize, to create paranoia, to make the witness question their own perceptions. By appearing with authority but no credentials, they created cognitive dissonance. The witness knew something was wrong but couldn't articulate what. They wanted to report the encounter but didn't know to whom. The visitors claimed to represent official systems, so how do you report them to those same systems? It was a psychological trap, and it was remarkably effective. Witnesses became isolated. They stopped talking about their experiences. They withdrew from research communities. They questioned their own memories and perceptions. If the goal was to prevent information from spreading, this method worked better than direct threats or intimidation, because it turned the witness's own mind against them. But here's where the theory gets darker, and more disturbing in its implications. Some researchers suggest that these follow-up encounters are not just monitoring or intimidation. They serve a deeper function. They're part of the experience itself. The UFO sighting is not the event, it's the trigger. The real interaction happens in the days and weeks and months that follow. In this interpretation, beings like Ingrid Cold are not separate from the UFO phenomenon. They are the UFO phenomenon, manifesting in a different form. The lights in the sky get your attention. They create the initial trauma or transformation, and then the phenomenon continues to interact with you through forms that are more personally invasive, through visitors who appear in your home, through dreams that feel more real than dreams should feel, through synchronicities that erode your confidence in consensus reality. The goal, in this framework, is not observation, it's transformation. The phenomenon is trying to change how you perceive reality, to open doors in your consciousness that you didn't know existed, to make you permeable to experiences that most humans never have access to. Why would it do this? We can only speculate. Perhaps it's conducting an experiment. Perhaps it's trying to communicate in the only way it knows how. Perhaps it's preparing certain individuals for something. Perhaps there is no goal at all, just interaction for its own sake. What we do know is that witnesses like Chris Bledsoe never fully return to normal. The experience marks them permanently. They become different people, more open to strange possibilities, more willing to question consensus reality, more aware that the world contains depths most people never perceive. In this interpretation, Ingrid Cold was not there to investigate or intimidate. He was there to continue the contact, to let Bledsoe know that what had begun by the Cape Fear River was not over, to ensure that he understood on some level that bypassed conscious thought that he had been chosen, marked, brought into a reality that most people never access, and if that's true, it worked. Because Bledsoe's life was never the same. The encounters continued, the strange events multiplied, and he became someone who lives between worlds, navigating both consensus reality and something stranger that exists alongside it. Whether Ingrid Cold was human, non-human, or something in between, his visit served its purpose. It ensured that Chris Bledsoe would never be able to forget what had happened on that cold January night. And it ensured that he would always be watching the sky, waiting for the lights to return, because they always do. Chapter 9. Psychological or non-human? This brings us to the core question, the one that every serious researcher must grapple with when examining cases like this, the question that has no easy answer but demands to be asked. What was Ingrid Cold? There are two dominant interpretations, two frameworks for understanding an encounter that resists simple explanation, and the truth, if we can ever access it, probably lies somewhere in the complex space between them. The first interpretation is psychological. The human mind is extraordinarily complex. It processes vast amounts of sensory data every second, filtering most of it out to create a coherent narrative of experience. Under normal circumstances, this works well. We perceive reality in ways that allow us to function, navigate, survive. But under conditions of extreme stress or trauma, these processes can break down. The mind can create false memories. It can distort real experiences. It can generate perceptions that feel absolutely real but have no external referent. This is not a weakness, it's a feature. The mind is designed to find patterns, create coherence, generate meaning. When faced with something that doesn't fit existing frameworks, it adapts. It creates an explanation that makes sense within the person's understanding of how reality works. Chris Bledsoe experienced something profoundly traumatic by the Cape Fear River. Whether it was truly anomalous or had some conventional explanation, the psychological impact was real. The fear, the disorientation, the sense of encountering something beyond comprehension. In the days following such an experience, the mind is vulnerable, still processing, still trying to make sense of what happened. Defense mechanisms are active. The person is in a heightened state of alertness, scanning for threats, interpreting neutral stimuli as potentially dangerous. In this state, it's possible that Bledsoe did receive a visitor, perhaps a journalist who had somehow learned about the sighting, perhaps a local investigator, perhaps even a legitimate government employee who happened to be in the area and was curious about the report. And in Bledsoe's traumatized, hyper-alert state, his mind transformed that visitor into something strange. Memory distortion amplified by stress created the odd behaviours, the mechanical speech, the lack of credentials. His mind filled in gaps with elements drawn from cultural narratives about men in black, creating a coherent story that fit the trauma he had just experienced. The odd name could be a memory error. Perhaps the visitor gave a normal name that Bledsoe misheard or misremembered. The lack of credentials could be a detail his stressed mind simply overlooked. The strange behaviours could be normal behaviours interpreted through the lens of trauma as threatening and wrong. This is the rational explanation, the one that fits within consensus reality and psychological science, and it cannot be entirely dismissed. We know that memory is malleable. We know that trauma affects perception. We know that people under stress misinterpret neutral stimuli. There are decades of research supporting these facts. But here's the problem. This explanation doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain how Ingrid Cold demonstrated knowledge of details Bledsoe had never shared publicly, details about the sighting that only Bledsoe and his immediate family knew. Unless there was surveillance, which Bledsoe's subsequent investigations found no evidence of, there's no conventional way for a stranger to possess that information. It doesn't explain why no person or agency ever claimed responsibility for the visit, why no one came forward when Bledsoe made inquiries, why his FOIA requests turned up nothing. If a real person conducted that interview, they should exist somewhere in some system, but they don't. It doesn't explain the predictions that came true, the specific statements Ingrid Cold made about future events in Bledsoe's life that materialized exactly as described. Unless we're willing to attribute all of that to coincidence, which strengthens credibility, it doesn't explain the patterns. The fact that dozens of other UFO witnesses have reported nearly identical encounters with visitors who display the same behaviours, ask the same types of questions, and vanish in the same inexplicable way. If each case was individual psychological distortion, the distortions shouldn't be so consistent across different people in different locations at different times. The psychological explanation accounts for some elements, but not all, and the elements it can't account for are precisely the ones that make this case significant. Which brings us to the second interpretation, non-human intelligence. If the UFO encounter itself was real, if what Chris Bledsoe witnessed that night was genuinely anomalous and not susceptible to conventional explanation, then we must consider the possibility that Ingrid Cold was part of that same phenomenon. Not a government investigator, not a misremembered journalist, but something else entirely. Something that understood it needed to present as human authority, but lacked the full capacity to execute that presentation convincingly. This would explain everything the psychological model struggles with. The impossible knowledge becomes explicable if Ingrid Cold was connected to whatever intelligence orchestrated the UFO encounter. If he was part of the same system, he would naturally know details about the event without need for surveillance or investigation. The lack of records becomes logical if Ingrid Cold never existed within human systems. If he was a construct, a temporary manifestation created for this specific interaction, then of course there would be no employment history, no documentation, no trace in official databases. The strange behaviours make sense if this was an attempt by non-human intelligence to mimic human authority figures. The formal speech patterns could reflect an understanding of how officials should speak based on outdated or incomplete information. The rigid posture could be a misunderstanding of human body language. The lack of blinking could be a simple oversight in the mimicry. The name itself could be a translation error or a designation that was never meant to be a convincing human name. Just a label that would suffice for this brief interaction. In this interpretation, Ingrid Cold was never human. He was something wearing a human appearance the way we might wear a costume, close enough to pass casual inspection but revealing its artificiality upon closer examination. But this interpretation raises its own difficult questions. If Ingrid Cold was a non-human entity, what was he? An alien in a physical sense? Some kind of interdimensional being? A construct created through technology we don't understand? A manifestation of consciousness that doesn't require physical substrate? Why appear at all? If the goal was simply to monitor witnesses, there are less detectable methods. Why risk exposure through direct contact? Why the bureaucratic approach? Why mimic government authority specifically? What purpose does that serve? And most fundamentally, if non-human intelligence has the capacity to create convincing human forms, why create one that's not quite convincing? Why include elements that trigger the uncanny valley response? Why not make the disguise perfect, unless imperfection is intentional? Unless the strangeness serves a purpose? Unless the goal is not to be convincing but to be memorable? To create an experience that will stick in the witness's mind? To generate exactly the kind of confusion and questioning that makes the encounter significant? In psychological operations, there's a technique called defamiliarization. You take something familiar and make it slightly wrong. This triggers deeper processing. The mind can't simply categorize it as normal and move on. It has to engage. It has to question. It has to remember. If non-human intelligence understands human psychology, and there's considerable evidence it does, then sending a visitor who is almost human but not quite might be a deliberate strategy. It ensures the witness will remember, will question, will be transformed by the experience. But here's the deepest question, the one that both interpretations struggle with. Why does it matter which explanation is correct? Whether Ingrid Cold was a psychological manifestation or a non-human entity, the effect on Chris Bledsoe was the same. His reality was fundamentally altered. He experienced something that resisted conventional explanation. He was marked by an encounter that transformed his relationship with consensus reality. From Bledsoe's subjective perspective, the distinction between real and psychological becomes meaningless. The experience was real to him. It had real consequences. It changed his life in measurable ways. This is what researchers mean when they talk about experiential reality. What matters is not necessarily what objectively occurred, but what the witness experienced and how that experience affected them. Ingrid Cold existed. Maybe not in the way a normal human exists, maybe not in physical space the way we understand it, but he existed in Chris Bledsoe's experience, and that existence had consequences. The two interpretations, psychological and non-human, are not necessarily exclusive. Reality may be stranger and more complex than either framework alone can capture. Perhaps consciousness and external reality interact in ways that make the boundary between them more permeable than we usually assume. Perhaps high strangeness encounters occur in a space where psychology and objective reality blur together, where the mind's capacity to create experience intersects with genuine anomalous phenomena, where the question, did this really happen, becomes impossible to answer because it happened in a mode that doesn't fit our categories of real versus imaginary. The case of Ingrid Cold remains unresolved. We have one witness's testimony. We have patterns that connect this case to many others. We have an absence of documentation that is itself significant. But we have no definitive proof, no smoking gun that would confirm either interpretation beyond doubt, and perhaps that's exactly how it's meant to be. because the uncertainty, the ambiguity, the impossibility of resolution, these are all part of the experience, part of what makes high strangeness cases transformative. They force us to sit with not knowing, to accept that reality might be more complex than our frameworks can capture, to recognise that our confident categories of real versus unreal, human versus non-human, psychological versus objective, might be insufficient for understanding what's actually happening. Ingrid Cold walked out of Chris Bledsoe's house and vanished. Where he went, we cannot say. Whether he ever truly existed in the first place, we cannot prove. But he left behind questions that refuse to be easily answered, and sometimes the questions themselves are the point. Chapter 10. Why the Story Persists. We're now several years past the original encounter. Chris Bledsoe's experience with Ingrid Cold has entered the permanent record of high strangeness cases. It's discussed in research forums, analysed in books, referenced by investigators working on similar cases. The question is, why? Why does this story persist when so many others fade into obscurity? The case of Ingrid Cold endures because it resists easy categorization. It occupies a unique space in UFO research, not flashy enough for mainstream media attention, not obscure enough to be forgotten, sitting precisely in that zone where serious researchers find the most interesting data. Consider what this case is not. It is not sensational. There are no dramatic abductions, no surgical procedures performed by aliens, no apocalyptic warnings delivered by otherworldly beings. The encounter with Ingrid Cold was quiet, mundane almost, in its execution. A man knocked on a door, asked questions, left. That's the entire visible sequence of events. From an outside observer's perspective, nothing extraordinary occurred. This mundanity is precisely what makes it compelling, because the devil is in the details. The strangeness emerges not from what happened, but from how it happened, the small discrepancies, the subtle wrongness, the accumulation of minor anomalies that add up to something significant. There are no threats. Ingrid Cold never intimidated Bledsoe, never warned him to stay silent, never made veiled or explicit threats about consequences if he spoke publicly about his experience. The classic Men in Black narrative involves intimidation, but this case lacks that element. Instead, the intimidation, if we can call it that, was more subtle. It came from the encounter itself, from the wrongness of Ingrid Cold's presence, from the realization that someone who shouldn't exist had shown up and demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't possess. The psychological impact was profound, but it didn't come from threats. It came from destabilization, from having your reality undermined in small but significant ways. There are no dramatic confrontations, no chase scenes, no physical evidence left behind, no photographs or recordings, just one man's testimony about a 30-minute conversation that officially never happened. It's a quiet encounter, almost mundane in its execution. And yet, it lingers. It refuses to be dismissed or forgotten. It occupies mental space in researchers and witnesses who encounter the story. Why? Because it taps into something primal, something that operates below conscious reasoning. The fear of being watched, not by cameras or governments in the conventional sense, but by something that exists outside the normal frameworks of observation, something that sees you without your knowledge or consent, something that knows things about you it has no business knowing. The fear of authority without accountability. We live in systems built on accountability. Police officers have badge numbers, federal agents have supervisors, even the most powerful individuals operate within structures that theoretically provide oversight. But what if you encounter authority that has no oversight, that answers to no one, that can operate completely outside normal systems of accountability? That's a fundamentally different kind of power, and it's terrifying precisely because it's unconstrained. The fear that the people who claim to protect us might not be people at all. We build our societies on certain assumptions. One of those assumptions is that we can recognize other humans, that we know what human behavior looks like, that anyone who walks and talks like a person is a person. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if human appearance can be mimicked by something non-human? What if the familiar forms we encounter daily might occasionally be masks worn by something else entirely? That possibility undermines fundamental trust. It makes every interaction potentially suspect. It introduces paranoia into the most basic social exchanges. These fears are not rational in the conventional sense. They're evolutionary. They're wired deep in our psychology. And the Ingrid Cold case activates all of them without providing any resolution or comfort. The case also persists because it's modern. This is not a story from the 1950s, buried in dusty files and fading memories. This happened in 2007, in the age of digital records and pervasive surveillance, in a time when anonymity should be nearly impossible to achieve. If this case had occurred in 1953, we could dismiss the lack of documentation as a product of that era. Records were less comprehensive, information systems were more fragmented. It was easier for things to slip through the cracks. But in 2007, in an era where almost everyone leaves digital footprints, where employment records are computerized, where background checks can surface information from decades past, where the internet makes anonymity increasingly difficult, the complete absence of any trace of Ingrid Cold in this context is far more significant. It suggests either a level of operational security that exceeds anything in the public knowledge base, or it suggests someone who never existed within human systems in the first place. And yet Ingrid Cold remains anonymous, despite the digital tools available, despite the searchable databases, despite the interconnected information systems that theoretically make everyone traceable. He exists only in Chris Bledsoe's testimony, only in the pattern of similar encounters reported by other witnesses, only in the negative space created by his absence from official records. There's also the matter of credibility. Chris Bledsoe never sought fame from this experience. He didn't immediately write a book. He didn't go on a media tour. He didn't start a podcast or a YouTube channel. He didn't attempt to monetize his encounter in any obvious way. He simply told his story, quietly and consistently, to researchers who were willing to listen without judgment, to investigators who approached the case with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined conclusions. That authenticity matters, because when someone fabricates a story, they tend to embellish. They add dramatic elements. They make themselves the hero. They create a narrative arc that builds to a satisfying conclusion. Bledsoe did none of that. His account is restrained, almost reluctant. He describes what happened without trying to convince anyone it happened. He presents the facts as he experienced them and leaves the interpretation to others. He admits to uncertainty where uncertainty exists. He acknowledges elements that might have conventional explanations. He doesn't claim to know things he doesn't know. This restraint is a hallmark of genuine experience. People who have truly encountered something anomalous often struggle to describe it. They use tentative language. They acknowledge gaps in their understanding. They resist the neat narratives that fictional accounts tend to produce. Bledsoe's testimony has that quality. It feels real precisely because it doesn't feel polished. It contains inconsistencies, not because he's lying, but because memory is imperfect and traumatic experiences are hard to articulate clearly. And that restraint is what makes it credible to serious researchers. They've encountered enough hoaxes and attention seekers to recognise the difference. The lack of embellishment is evidence of authenticity. The case also persists because it connects to something larger. It's not an isolated data point. It's part of a pattern that extends across decades and geographical boundaries. Other witnesses have reported similar encounters. The behaviours described, the impossible knowledge, the lack of credentials, the mechanical speech, the sudden appearances and disappearances. These patterns suggest a phenomenon, something systematic rather than random, something that repeats with enough consistency to indicate intelligence and purpose, and phenomena demand explanation. They resist being dismissed as one-off anomalies. They force serious engagement because they keep happening. The Ingrid Cold case has become a reference point. When new witnesses come forward with similar experiences, researchers compare notes. They look for common elements. They build databases of characteristics. And Ingrid Cold keeps appearing in those databases, not literally but as a pattern, as a type, as an example of how these encounters tend to unfold. That's why the story persists. Not because it's sensational or dramatic, but because it's representative. It captures something essential about a type of experience that continues to occur. And as long as people keep reporting visits from strange men who claim authority without proving it, who know things they shouldn't know, and who vanish without trace, the case of Ingrid Cold will remain relevant. It's a template, a framework for understanding encounters that resist conventional explanation. A reminder that sometimes the most disturbing events are not the ones that make headlines, but the quiet ones that happen behind closed doors and leave no evidence except in the transformed consciousness of the witness. Epilogue: The agent without a file. So who was Ingrid Cold? After all this examination, all this analysis, all this careful consideration of evidence and interpretation, we return to the question that started this journey, and we find that we still don't have a definitive answer. We may never know. If he was human, there should be records. Every human who works for a government agency, every person who conducts official business leaves traces. Employment history, tax records, a social security number, a driver's license, background checks, security clearances, something. In the modern bureaucratic state, it's almost impossible to function officially without generating documentation. The entire system is built on paper trails and digital footprints. You cannot move through official channels without leaving evidence of your movement. But there's nothing. No employment records, no tax documentation, no security clearances, no badge numbers, no supervisors who remember assigning someone to investigate a UFO sighting in rural North Carolina. No databases that contain any reference to the name Ingrid Cold in connection with official government work. The search has been exhaustive. Researchers have pursued every lead. FOIA requests have covered every conceivable agency. Private investigators have run background checks. The usual tools for verifying someone's existence and identity have all been deployed, and every single one has come back negative. If he was not human, if he was something else entirely, then the absence of records makes perfect sense. Because how do you document something that was never real in the conventional sense? How do you create an employment file for a temporary manifestation? How do you issue a social security number to a construct that exists only long enough to conduct one interview? How do you generate background checks for an entity that has no background? The absence of records could be evidence not of secretive efficiency, but of fundamental non-existence within human systems. The most convincing disguises, after all, are the ones that don't need to be explained. They simply exist briefly in the space between perception and reality. A perfect disguise would leave no trail because there would be nothing to trace. It would be smoke, appearing solid enough to be seen, but dissolving the moment you try to grasp it. Ingrid Cold appeared. He manifested at Chris Bledsoe's door with enough substance to be perceived, engaged with, remembered. He asked his questions with enough presence to create the impression of authority and purpose. He demonstrated knowledge he should not have had, suggesting either impossible surveillance or impossible connection to the phenomenon itself. And then he left, dissolving back into whatever void he had emerged from, not leaving, through normal means, not getting into a car and driving away, just ceasing to be present, transitioning from existence to non-existence in the space between the door and the driveway. Chris Bledsoe is still alive, still living in North Carolina, still experiencing intermittent contact with whatever phenomenon marked him that January night in 2007. He has had additional sightings, additional encounters. The strangeness has not stopped. If anything, it has deepened, become more integrated into his life. He has learned to live with it, to navigate both ordinary reality and the stranger reality that exists alongside it. He still tells his story when asked, but he no longer expects answers. He has accepted that some questions cannot be answered within our current frameworks of understanding, that some experiences exist beyond the reach of conventional explanation. He knows what he experienced. He was there. He sat across from Ingrid Cold. He heard that mechanical voice. He felt that uncanny presence. The encounter was real in every way that matters, whether others believe it, whether it can be proven, whether it fits within consensus reality. These have become secondary concerns. The encounter happened. It changed him. It opened doors in his consciousness that most people never access. It made him aware that the world contains depths and complexities that resist our neat categories and comfortable explanations, and he is not alone. Other witnesses continue to come forward. Other people report visits from strange figures who claim authority without proving it, who know things they shouldn't know, who appear and disappear in ways that defy conventional explanation. The pattern continues, the phenomenon persists. Whatever intelligence operates behind these encounters shows no sign of stopping. Because some encounters are not meant to be understood in conventional terms. They are meant to transform, to destabilize, to remind us that the world is stranger than we allow ourselves to believe, that there are doors we don't see until they open, visitors we cannot track until they appear, questions we're not equipped to answer with our current models of reality. Ingrid Cold walked through one of those doors, or perhaps he was the door itself, a threshold between ordinary reality and something else, something that most people never access but that some, through accident or design, encounter directly. And somewhere, in some record system we cannot access, his visit may still be logged, not in FBI databases or CIA files or Department of Defense archives, but in whatever system actually tracks these encounters, whatever intelligence actually monitors contact between human witnesses and phenomena that refuse to be categorized. That record exists somewhere, in some framework we haven't discovered, in some archive beyond our current ability to access, not under his name, because Ingrid Cold was never his name. It was never meant to be a real name. It was simply what he called himself, a designation that served its purpose for exactly 30 minutes, long enough to ask the questions, to demonstrate the impossible knowledge, to create the destabilization, and then to dissolve back into whatever matrix of reality generates such manifestations, leaving behind only a witness who will never forget, a story that will never be fully explained, and questions that will persist as long as people continue to look at the sky and wonder what else might be looking back. Closing thoughts. The Ingrid Cold case sits at the intersection of UFO research, men in black law, and modern high strangeness phenomena. It is a case without resolution, without proof, without closure. And perhaps that's the point, because the most effective way to control information is not to suppress it entirely. That creates martyrs, that generates suspicion, that makes the information more compelling through its very prohibition. No, the most effective way to control information is to make it unverifiable, to ensure that even when someone tells the truth, no one can prove it. To create a zone of ambiguity where the signal is real but permanently mixed with noise. To make truth and fiction indistinguishable. To ensure that anyone sharing the information can be dismissed as mistaken, delusional, or attention-seeking. This is more effective than censorship, because it allows the information to exist while stripping it of credibility. It creates a kind of containment through confusion. The truth is spoken, but it cannot spread effectively because it cannot be verified. If that's the strategy behind visits like Ingrid Cold's, it's remarkably successful. Because Bledsoe's story exists, it's available, anyone can hear it, but it exists in that zone where proof is impossible and doubt is always available. Ingrid Cold may have been a psychological manifestation, a distorted memory, a misidentified visitor whose normal characteristics were transformed by trauma into something strange. Or he may have been exactly what he appeared to be, an agent without a file, a representative of something we do not understand, a reminder that we are being watched by forces we cannot see, much less verify or control. The case remains open. Not officially, because there was never an official investigation. There were never official records. There is no official file to close. But in the minds of those who study the unexplained, in the collections of researchers who document high strangeness encounters, in the consciousness of witnesses like Chris Bledsoe, who have crossed thresholds most people never approach, Ingrid Cold is still out there, still asking questions, still collecting data, still appearing at the homes of witnesses who have seen something they were perhaps not meant to see, and still leaving no trace, still generating no documentation, still existing in that impossible space between consensus, reality, and something stranger. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this story through all its complexities and ambiguities. Thank you for being willing to sit with questions that have no easy answers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest cases in modern UFO research, please consider supporting the channel. Use your hype points if you're watching on YouTube. It genuinely helps more than you know and allows us to keep creating these detailed investigations into the unexplained. Leave a review if you're on Spotify. Reviews help other listeners find us and let us know what kinds of stories resonate with you. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We love hearing from you. We love knowing that these stories are reaching people in different time zones, different countries, different contexts. There's something beautiful about a global community united by curiosity about the strange and unexplained. Until next time, sleep well. Or try to, at least. And remember, not everyone who knocks on your door is who they claim to be. Not everyone who claims authority can prove it. Not everyone who knows things they shouldn't know has a conventional explanation for that knowledge. The world is stranger than we usually admit, full of doors we don't see, visitors we cannot track, encounters that transform us in ways we never fully understand. Chris Bledsoe opened one of those doors, or perhaps it was open for him. Perhaps it was never a door at all, but a threshold that dissolved the moment he crossed it, leaving him changed and unable to return to the innocent assumptions he once held about how reality works. That's what high strangeness does. It marks you, changes you, makes it impossible to see the world the same way again. And somewhere out there, Ingrid Cold continues his work, asking his questions, appearing at the homes of witnesses, demonstrating impossible knowledge, and then vanishing, leaving behind only confusion, questions, and the slow transformation of consciousness that comes from encountering something that should not exist. This is Sleep Theories. Good night, and sweet dreams. Though after this story, I'm not sure how sweet those dreams will be.